Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you in the third session of the second day of 3 days International E-Conference on Rethinking the Post-Colonial Text and Contexts organized by New Literaria Journal in collaboration with Assam University, a central university in India. In this session, we have Professor Dr. Himadri Lahiri sir with us, former professor in the Department of English and Culture Studies at the University of Burdwan and presently professor at Netaji Subhas Open University, Kolkata. And this session will be chaired by respected Dr. Himadri Lahiri sir. And in this session, we have two speakers with us, Professor Dr. Aparajita Hajra ma'am and Professor Silvija Jestrovic ma'am. Now, I would like to request Professor Dr. Himadri Lahiri sir to chair this session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Quite well, sir.
So let me begin the session. Very good afternoon, everyone. And this will be a very promising session. And the first speaker, there will be two speakers, very important speakers. The first speaker will be Professor Silvija Jestrovic. I hope I have pronounced the name properly. She teaches at Warwick University, and the second speaker will be Professor Aparajita Hajra, who teaches English at Sidhu Kano Bisha University. I will first invite Professor Silvija Jestrovic of Warwick University to kindly present her paper, which has a title, very interesting title, Between Embodiment and Textualization, Faustian Authoring and Shakespearean Colonizing. I will only request both the speakers to help me maintaining the time. We will have 20 minutes each, and we'll have question answer session at the end of the session after the second speaker presents her paper. So over to you, Professor Silvija Jestrovic.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. Pronunciation was perfect. So my talk is based on my recent work for my book called The Author Dies Hard. Actually, the full title, Performances of Authorial Presence and Absence. The Author Dies Hard, and that starts from Roland Barthes' proposition of the death of the author, and it kind of tests this provocation. Looking
at be kindly a bit louder if that is possible. I'm not sure.
Okay. Yes. Is this a little bit better?
It's better. It's better.
Okay. So the starting point is Roland Barthes' proposition of the death of the author. So my questions in the book were: do all the authors die the same way, or is it just the death of the Western white hegemonic author? Do, for instance, female authors die the same way? Do authors of color die the same way, and so on? So the bit of research that I will share here is from a part that kind of historicizes the birth of the author, the Western author, in a sense, and looks at this cusp between embodiment and textualization that came with the invention of print. And I'm looking at quite iconic, quite well sort of elaborated example, which is Shakespeare and Shakespeare's Prospero in the first place. But hopefully it might trigger some further thoughts and some further ideas. So I dwell into it to also save the time as well. So the emergence of print culture resulted in the separation between the embodied and the textual. Marking a turning point in the process of fixing the author. Moreover, the change was not only in the culture of authorship, but also in the legal relationship between the author and the work. The emergence of copyright further stabilized the authorial identity and claim. while the invention of print also enabled faster reproduction and transmission of the work. The printing, the printed copies served severed the physical relationship between author and the work. Even if names of individual authors were often lost in transmission process, the handwriting remained a testament to the individuality of the person performing the writing. As Louis Mumford writes in his essay, The Invention of Print, handwriting is the key of human personality, so much so that when one wants to refer to the highest type of individualization in art, we refer to the artist's signature. The metaphor of the artist's signature is somewhat paradoxical, given that on the one hand, the persona of, say, the medieval author artist was usually little known or even entirely anonymous. On the other hand, the material fact of the author's handwriting is also an inscription of the authorial presence. His unique cursive and fingerprints were ingrained in the texture of the work, even if the artist himself had been lost and forgotten in the transmission process. Hence, graphology often remains as an insight into the author's persona, even if all other elements of his subjectivity have vanished. With the invention of print, this material presence of the author within the work has been erased. The disembodiment of the authorial self from the text that Barthes writes about could almost be understood at face value here as the junction between embodiment and textualization. The disappearance of the authorial self is of a different order from that of the preprint author, who amalgamated with voices, rhythms, gestures, handwritings of others who were part of the ongoing transmission process. The author disappeared through labor and performance, both of his own and that of other who came after him, into the transmission process, which was not yet the transmission machine, and we'll get to the transmission machine later. Even though the transmission machine is a metaphor that also includes intertextual dialogues and interperformative references, criticism and scholarship, the invention of the actual physical object, the printing press, increased the possibility of transmission. With its root in art printmaking, print swept the world, as we know, in less than a century, traveling from China and Korea, where the first movable type was invented, to Europe, and to be more precise, in the little German town of Mainz, where in 1455, Johannes Gutenberg printed the first book, the Latin Bible. Mumford argues that before the new methods of transmission took hold, the new technical invention necessitated a new social order and a new social medium. And he writes, a community that abandoned slavery and was ready, indeed eager, to equalize cultural advantages once reserved for the ruling castes. We will return to this overly optimistic point and the complexities of this democratization as we go into Prospero Shakespeare. For now, we can say that the invention of print opened the possibility for art and culture to have a wider reach, both directly and consequentially, to move more freely across boundaries of class and culture, and for the author to eventually find a more stable place in his own time and eventually in posterity. I say his rather than his, hers, because her position was much different, as we also know. So, for example, Chaucer, a self-described compilator, so somebody who actually compiles the words of others and bridges them together, inscribed his authorial persona into the text, but was not a professional author yet. About a century and a half later, Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe will make a living from their writing. Marlowe and Shakespeare are credited as the creators of two iconic dramatic characters, Dr. Faustus and Prospero, respectively, subjects to still many readings, performances, interpretations, intertextual renditions, and so on. I propose here to read these two dramatic figures as epitomes of different concepts of authorial presence in the text and also in performance. The shift in the concept of the authorial figure was coincident with the invention of print, that gave rise to professionalization and copyright laws, as well as with a change in the author's relationship to God, authority, and power. And Dr. Faustus explores this very well. Both Faustus and Prospero are lonely humanist subjects, and in both instances, the conjuring, the making of magic, can be read as a theatrical metaphor. Now, I will not go very much into Dr. Faustus because I want to dwell into Shakespeare the Colonizer, but just as a point of reference, Faustus as a Faust as a metaphor of the author is the one who makes or fails to make a moral choice. And I think this will become important in my reading of Prospero. This choice always comes with a price and the predicament of failure of one kind or another. Yet the nature of that choice varies. For some, it is shaped by moral weakness. For others, it is an act of courage that for better or worse cannot be helped. And we see this in various 20th centuries and 21st centuries rendering of Faust, for Thomas Mann, Klaus Mann, in Bulgakov, in Václav Havel, and so on. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus arguably belongs to the former. He is an ethical failure. And Marlowe's Faustus says, I'll burn my books, Mephistopheles, and he's very panic-stricken. So he offers to shift the responsibility from himself to the books that allegedly seduced him. Faustus, taken as a metaphor of the author, emerges here as a failed, yet more autonomous figure than his medieval predecessors. He is no longer under the full authority of God, no longer only the transmitter of knowledge from the author with capital A, but also a figure responsible for his own words and deeds. Hence, the author with a small a starts to emerge more boldly at this point. Even at the cost of great punishment, he, and eventually she, is free to fail. While to save his skin, Faustus offers his book as a sacrifice to Mephistopheles, Shakespeare's Prospero decides to let go of his books, the single source of his knowledge and unbound power of his own free will. So he gives this power away, basically, in the end, doesn't he? Faustus and Prospero, both tampering with magic powers and both offering allegories of the author, artist, theater maker, could be read in juxtaposition. The former, at the end, denounces personal responsibility. The books alone can take the blame, while he, Faustus, might still be saved if only he could disappear into the textual machine. In The Tempest, Prospero is the complete author of the revenge and forgiveness plot that unfolds. With the assistance of his sidekick or lackey, Ariel, he stages its every aspect, from the shipwreck and the twists and turns of fortune to the theater within the theater scene, the mask to celebrate the engagement of his daughter. Every unpredictability, normally at the heart of performance, such as the episode with the drunken clowns that Caliban mistakes for gods, is dealt with immediately and put under control. The events that Prospero conjures unfold as absolutely flawless immersive theater. And at the end, there is a lesson to be learned by all of the participants. Prospero demonstrates complete control, not only of his utterance and its impact, but also of the performativity of language that is both verbal and embodied. There is no escape from the performativity, as every transgression, linguistic or physical, is quickly put under control of an overall structure that Prospero guards with ease. In the gesture of renouncing his powers, Prospero thus demonstrates incredible restraint, humility, and above all ethical capacity, a full awareness of the author's responsibility within and beyond the work that he has authored. Nevertheless, postcolonial writing, performance, and scholarship posits a challenge to the Faust-Prospero juxtaposition along the simple lines of the author's moral weakness on the one hand and ethical rigor on the other. Various incarnations of Faust as conjurer, failed maker, agent provocateur, author, artist, point to the playful and tragic ambiguity of Faustus as an authorial figure who pushes the limits of both weakness and courage. More contextual readings of The Tempest have, however, revealed a more sinister side of Prospero. The wider context and its resonances in the play are well known, hence just a brief reiteration here. By the time Shakespeare writes his penultimate play, England has already caught up with the Spanish and the Portuguese on sea voyages, discoveries, and also slave trade between West Africa and the New World. Sir Francis Drake has completed his voyage around the world. The term noble savage has entered the language. Sugar and molasses arrived from Guyana, and the East India Company was formed just a decade before The Tempest was completed. So, and there are various works that trace these potential contextual influences on Shakespeare's choices. So the seemingly fantastic creatures of Caliban, Ariel, and Caliban's witch mother Sycorax, whom Prospero imprisoned in a tree trunk for eternity, were indeed not only the figments of the playwright's imagination, but also embodiments of how the collective cultural imagination of the time constructed the other from faraway shores of Africa and the Caribbean. Prospero, the author of the immersive performance and the morality play that features a great shipwreck, a love story, a revenge tale, a noble savage, airborne acts, and more, is also the colonizer. But the colonial conquest, the author becomes more distinct, with the colonial conquest, the author becomes more distinctly white, male, and European, and of European origin than before. Textualization validates authorship in a new way, whereby performances of the author of the oral traditions, for instance, were more often than not lost in translation. The author not only made a living from his craft, but played his part in cultural conquests. Colonial violence could thus also be described as an imposition of text over other ways of authoring and transmitting culture, of imposing a language that dictates socio-communal structures that differ from the local ones. By the time Prospero denounces his power, frees his obedient servant Ariel, and returns the island to its rightful owner, according to the final scene of the play, a repentant and more quote-unquote civilized Caliban, and heads back to where he had originally come from, irrevocable damage has already been done. Helen Tiffin links textualization and the subsequent canonization of Shakespeare with colonial violence when she writes, "The circulation of Shakespeare's book within educational and cultural spheres has been a powerful hegemonic force throughout the history of British Empire, and it is one which continues to operate in virtually all colonies." As Derrida puts it, the imposition of language is, he says, the first act of violence. In his adaptation of Shakespeare's play entitled A Tempest from 1969, Amy Cesar, the famous Martinican playwright and poet of negritude, brings the dispossessed center stage and foregrounds the violent performativity of language already inherent in the original play. For example, when Caliban greets Prospero in his mother tongue, and Prospero snaps, "Mumbling your native language again." Native language becomes the forbidden language. Still, Caliban reads through the strategies of suppressing colonial subjects with great accuracy when he confronts Prospero saying, "You didn't teach me a thing except to jabber in your own language so that I could understand your orders." When Prospero says to Caliban, "Beating is the only language you really understand, so much the worse for you, I'll speak it loud and clear," a direct correlation between the violence of language and physical violence has been established. Indeed, this violent performativity of language is already present in the text of the Bard through the words of Prospero describing the punishment a disobedient Caliban is to suffer. And he says, "For this be sure tonight thou shalt have cramps, side stitches, that shall pen they breath up, urchins shall for the vast of night, that they may work, all exercise on thee. You shall be pinched as thick as honeycomb, each pinch more stinging than bees that may them." So these words create vivid visual images of torture as they become physicalized onto the body disciplined into obedience. For George Lemming, the link between body, corporal punishment, and obedience of the colonial subject in the play becomes palpable and literal in the context of colonial history. In his book, The Pleasure of Exile, Lemming draws direct parallels between documentary accounts of the torture of slaves in Haiti that was used to persuade them to work, and the words in the play. Some are indeed remarkably similar to Prospero's repertoire of punishments. They were, as the slaves were fastened to nests of asps or buried alive up to their neck, their heads smeared with sugar that flies might devour them. The author is thus not only the maker, the conjurer, the creative force, but also the authority whose authoring is that of the text and of the performance, as well as of the violence of both. As indeed violence first emerges in language, logos, before it translates onto bodies. This casts a long dark shadow on Mumford's optimistic comment mentioned earlier, when he identified a new and more progressive social consciousness as a prerequisite to the invention of print. Despite transgressions of class and authority and various renegotiations of the relationship to God in the European context of the time, the newly constructed author was still in need of some other to lord over, to echo the philosopher Terry Egerton. The printing press became the textual machine in many ways. It democratized art, knowledge, and ways of being an author-maker. It also instrumentalized language, text, and their transmission in hitherto unprecedented ways. In Shakespeare the Tempest, the figure of Sycorax emerges as the other to the author, as well as potentially the other author, marginalized, silenced, confined to the tree trunk, hidden from the public eye, and excluded from the transmission process. This author is neither male nor white. English is not her language either. In The Tempest, she is referred to only sporadically as one so strong that could control moon, make flows and ebbs. The authorial figure of Sycorax is positioned as a Manichaean double to Prospero, her abilities judged inferior, her powers dark, her magic unethical, her deeds unlawful, her offspring vile and incompetent, as arguments to legitimize Prospero's ruling of the island. Anya Lumba too identifies Sycorax as Prospero's other, asking that Caliban's invocation of the past should include the retelling of Sycorax's story. Taking the cue from Lumba, playwright and performer Chin Woon Ping in her play Sycorax rewrites the figure of Sycorax as a parodic pastiche. And in her description of the process, she says, mulling over the implication of her difference and her history, or lack of, to imagine the possibility of speaking through and for her in performance. Pink imagines a performance, Sycorax, my author, asking what would she say were she to stage a return. In the production of Cuban Teatro Buendia, called Otra Tempestad, The Other Tempest, the script of the canonical author, the bard, and the colonizer has not only been dismantled and rewritten, it also has been subverted to assert a counter-performance in which Sycorax plays one of the pivotal roles. In Otra Tempestad, the other author is given a genealogy as she emerges accompanied with her three daughters, the Yoruban Orshas, Oshun, Oya, and Elegua. Here it is Sycorax, not Prospero, who authors the performance. While her daughters play the witches of Macbeth, Sycorax conjures up a storm to sink the ship.
Sorry for the intervention. Will you complete within 2 minutes or so?
Yes, that's
okay.
fine.
Okay,
That's fine.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. The ship transporting Prospero and other characters to the island. Sycorax and her collaborators also break the dominant linguistic idiom in favor of more embodied ways to tell the story. Through a spectacle of live music, they create various sounds of the island, while their movements and body language are drawn from the trance-induced Afro-Cuban dance of Santeria, characterized by its syncretism of African and Christian deities. The oppressive dominance of the text, the word, and the bard has been shaken and replaced with other forms of telling, doing that are visual, oral, embodied, and more fleeting. The theatricality and performativity of the embodied storytelling that Sycorax stages stands as a mode of resistance to the authorship for which the figure of Prospero stands. And now I'll just make a concluding point, and that's it. The Tempest is Also famously regarded as being Shakespeare's farewell play, with his protagonist Prospero standing in as the author's alter ego when he utters famous lines, "Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair." At this point, he is neither the conjurer, nor the bard, nor the colonizer, but a mere mortal, the author, the nobody. So how does this nobody go on such an extraordinary journey and transformation from a nobody to the celebrated bard, then to the sort of colonizer? There is a Derek Walcott play called on the Monkey's Mountain, where Shakespeare is put on trial against humanity, for example. The textual machine not only has the potential to disappear the author, but to enable the emergence of different scripts of the authorial persona. It has the capacity to resurrect the authorial figure in unpredictable and at times contradictory, critical, and politically charged ways. Simply put, somewhere in Europe, as the first folio emerges hot off the press, Shakespeare enters the textual machine as a nobody and emerges at the other end as the bard, the author, glorified, hailed, beloved, endlessly performed worldwide, unsurpassed. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the bard enters the textile machine and emerges on the distant shores of Africa, West Indies, and the Caribbean, in India and further afield as the colonizer, the author whose words shape the colonial bodies with as much force as the cracking whip of slave masters. Both the words and the whip left permanent marks. Exit the wise, benevolent Prospero, the aging bard's alter ego, and enter the raging slave master of Cesar, proclaiming, "This is how power is measured, I am power." Eventually, the author colonizer enters the textual machine and emerges at the other end, not as himself, but as the other whom he tried to dominate the entire time, or more precisely, as a multitude of others, writers, poets, theorists, performers. He is Cesar and Lemming, Wu Ping Ching and Lumba, Tiffin and Derek Walcott, and the makers from the Teatro Buendia. The list goes on. In this process, the author also becomes a social agent, whether in dialogue or in conflict with his predecessor or her, which is about the shattering of identities as much as the construction of them. Through these others, the author with the capital A, the bard, and the colonizer is deconstructed and reassembled in his own words and in the words, languages, and gesture of the others. Periodically, he could even become himself again, a nobody and potentially everybody. The textual machine is a wondrous rabbit hole, equally precarious and enchanting.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wonderful paper. I will reserve my comment for after. I shall give my comments after the second paper, and we'll have some discussion. But in the meantime, I will obviously request Professor Aparajita Hazra to present her paper. Welcome, Aparajita. Please present your paper.
Thank you very much, sir. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so yes. I'm going to share the screen. Let me see. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, yes.
Great. Yeah. So as the title indicates, I'm going to talk about reading history from below. Now, before I get down into business, I must really extend my heartiest greetings to Professor Himadri Lahiri, because, you know, sharing the same platform with a person as erudite and as genteel as him is really an honor. And I would also like to congratulate the earlier speaker, Sylvia, for that well-researched paper. Actually, I had an invitation to come earlier on into this webinar, but since given the present scenario of examinations and online exams, and me being the HOD, there was a meeting that I just could not wriggle out of. So here I am now. Let's make the most of it. So today I'm going to talk about how we can read history, or how we should rather read history from below. And I am going to take a few archival materials, like some letters that had been written during the colonial British period. And I'm going to try and analyze, deconstruct those letters and try to find out how language which again, harps on what Sylvia was also talking about, how language can sometimes be the vehicle of colonial discourse. So these are just those, introductory things that we all know. Antonio Gramsci, when he wrote the notes on Italian history, and then they became widely known as the prison notebooks, which were written between 1929 and 1935. Those set the cornerstone for post-colonial studies. And after that, we all know the Subaltern Studies Group, or the SSG, which comprised of a few very sprightly South Asian scholars who decided to take it on themselves to talk about post-colonial ideology of the world. They all hailed from the University of Sussex, and these were the people who started post-colonial studies and post-colonial studies on the imperial societies. Now, just for yes, these are the people. We can find Ranajit Guho, we have Dipesh Chakravarti, Partho Chatterjee, and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Now, the objective of the SS group was obviously dismantling the Eurocentric worldview, thereby subverting the marginalization that colonialism had normatized. Now, this is one thing that I'm going to talk about in my future slides also, how normativity sometimes proves to be a crippling factor for all kind of post-colonial studies. And post-colonialism, having when we really talk about the term post-colonialism, it's a term that seems to have a never say die attitude in a very pejorative sense. Just when we think that we have fought one kind of post-colonialism and one kind of colonialism, and just when we think that we are on the brink of stepping into post-colonialism, another kind of colonialism crops up. And like Gyugyi Wa Thiong'o once said, the colonialism of the mind is the most pernicious of all. So post-colonialism is one genre of studies that I think has a long way to go. It's nowhere near the end. History from below. Foreground the oppressed voices, give them agency, and alternate historiography needs to be written. Now, Ranajit Guho, in the Prose of Counterinsurgency, talks about how subalternity, what materialized by the structure of property, institutionalized by law, sanctified by religion, and made tolerable and even desirable by tradition. This is one comment that is very close to my heart, because I think this encompasses all those pernicious, vicious cycles that, eternize or perpetuate this vice called subalternity. So the things that are then coming into play are property, law, religion, and tradition. All of these things normatize and perpetuate the trend of colonialism, whatever kind it might be. Now, stereotypical and biased representation in history oftentimes happens, and thereby the voice of the colonized people oftentimes gets choked underneath the reams of history that has been written from the lens of a colonial perspective. And that is something that we need to subvert. Now, when we talk about representation, there is a huge politics of representation that is involved, because representation is a very tricky term. It's a loaded term, and it's also a very tricky term. Now, if we really talk about Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, she talked about the two kinds of representation. One is the Darstellen and the other is the Vertreten. I'm just showing them on the screen for you. So one is Darstellen and the other is Vertreten. Now, Darstellen is that kind of representation which happens from outside the community. That is, I do not belong to the colonized people, but I am representing the colonized people. That is called Darstellen. And Vertreten is when I am the colonized person and I am representing myself. So from inside the community, it becomes Vertreten. Now, obviously, Vertreten has to be much more authentic than what Darstellen can possibly do, because Darstellen is, whenever it is speaking, it is representation from the outside, whereas Vertreten is representation from the inside, which is bound to be much more authentic. But this Vertreten, which is supposed to be the voice of the colonized, the voice of the hegemonically oppressed, that sometimes becomes silenced. And what comes forth as representation is oftentimes Darstellen, and which oftentimes is mixed with a little bit of the flecks of colonialism, make their way into Darstellen. That is where the politics of representation comes in. So representation as depiction from outside is Darstellen, whereas the rhetoric as persuasion from inside would be called Vertreten. Now, today I'm going to talk in the context of some insurgencies. In India, we have had a lot of insurgencies that needed a representation, a proper representation in history. But unfortunately, sometimes the representation gets colored by the lenses of colonial attitude. So we have the Rangpur Dhing, against the Devi Sinha. We have the Barasat Bidroho in 1831, which was led by Titumir. The Santal Hul, Dhing, Hul. These words mean or connote revolution. So the Santal Hul, which happened in 1855, the Blue Mutiny or the Nil Bidroho, and then the revolts of the Kol. We had those indigenous communities like Kol, Bhil, Munda, the Santal and the Munda, the Sepoy rebellion, Shipai Bidroho. All these, they have been represented in history, but the historiography has been content to deal with the peasant rebel merely as an empirical person or a member of a class. What I mean to say is that each member of that clan, each member who had taken part in the rebellion had a thought process. But that thought process, that individuation, that individual thought process sometimes gets choked by this epistemic or empirical personality called those people. So each person is not taken as a rational entity whose will and reason constituted the praxis called revolution. Now, metaphors describing the peasant revolts to natural phenomena. Sometimes when the letters were written or the reports were written by the English people, by the British, about the peasants who were revolting, they were often, the objective correlative was often something akin to natural phenomena. Sometimes they were called, like, they break out like thunderstorms, they heave like earthquake, they spread like wildfires, they infect like epidemic. What I'm trying to point out is that when you liken somebody to earthquakes and thunderstorms and wildfires and epidemics, you are negating and thereby subverting the thought process behind those people who had gone into the revolution or the rebellion. Now, a couple of examples. I'm taking a couple of archival examples. One is, these are letters which had been taken from the collections of the India Office Library and some from the West Bengal State Archives. Now, the first letter that I'm going to quote over here is a letter which was written on 10th November 1831 to the Deputy Adjutant General of the Army on behalf of some W.C. Taylor, who was a secretary to the government military department. Now, this was in context of the Barasat Bidroho, which was led by Titumir. Now, I would just request you all to take a look at the language of the letter. I have quoted the letter for you. To the Deputy Adjutant General of the Army, Sir, I have marked out those parts which I want my audience to concentrate on in yellow. So authentic information, this is being talked about in context of the Barasat Bidroho. Authentic information having reached government that a body of fanatic insurgents, fanaticism negates reason, So the adjective fanatic immediately, subtracts the content of logic from the insurgency. Fanatic insurgents are now committing the most daring and wanton atrocities on the inhabitants of the country in the neighborhood of Tipi in the magistracy of Barasat, and have set at defiance and repulsed with the utmost force that the local civil authority could assemble for their apprehension. So they have been fanatics. They were daring and wanton, like it's just for nothing. The magistrate will meet the officer commanding the detachment at Barasat for the purpose of routing or seizing, or in the event of resistance, if the insurgents resist, that is, in the event of resistance, destroying those who persevere in defying the authority of the state and disturbing the public tranquility. I couldn't find a more blatant and brazen assertion of hegemonic power than this, defying the authority as if whatever the authority says, not listening to that, it takes away from the logic behind the rebellion. There's another letter from W.C. Taylor, Esquire, to F.S. Mudge, Esquire. Just give me a second. This is Tonmoy. Yes, Tonmoy? Hello? Yeah, am I audible, everybody? Hello?
Yes,
Yes,
perfectly audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Perfectly.
Yeah, ma'am, audible, ma'am. Audible, ma'am. Quite audible.
All right. Tonmoy had called up, but I didn't get what he said. Right, great. So continuing with the letter, this is a letter from W.C. Taylor, Esquire, to F.S. Mudge, Esquire, written on 7 July 1855. And the context is the Santal Hool. Me being in Purulia, we sometimes, every year, we commemorate Hool Dibosh. So the Santal Hool happened with a lot of logic behind it, a lot of thought process behind it. But look how the British represented it. My dear Mudge, there is a great gathering of Santals, 4,000 or 5,000 men at a place about 8 miles off, and I understand that they are all well armed with bows and arrows, talwars, spears, and that it is their intention to attack all the Europeans round and plunder and murder them. They are almost made a villain out of, it's not a rebellion that is being represented over here. It's almost as if a murder is being plotted out here. The cause of all this is that one of their gods is supposed to have taken the flesh and to have made his appearance at the Europeans and influential natives around. As this is the nearest point to the gathering, I suppose it will be first attacked. So, and it goes on and on. So you can understand the very denigrating tone of the letter, the condescending tone of the letter. It is almost, the letter reeks of hegemonic power. It reeks of hegemonic power binaries, that the superior, talking about the very inferior, so much inferior that they can be called thunderstorms, they can be called volcanoes, and they can be described by terms which don't even talk about humanity. The corpus of historical writings on peasant insurgency in colonial India is made up of 3 types of discourse. Now, one is the primary discourse. The one that I read out just now was primary discourse. Another is secondary discourse, and the third can be tertiary discourse. Now, what do we mean by the primary, secondary, and tertiary discourses? The primary discourse is official in character. It originated with the bureaucrats, soldiers, sleuths, and other directly employed by the government, like the letters that I read out just a little while ago. They were written by the bureaucrats. They were written by the people in the government. So these are primary discourses. Also with those in the non-official sector, but who were symbiotically related to the Raj. So these people, the people who were close to the colonizers, meant primarily for administrative use, for the information of government, for action on its part, and for the determination of its policy. What is a secondary discourse? It draws on the primary discourse as material, but it transforms it at the same time, and it is like history is written out of the primary discourses. So historiography in the raw, and the second is the processed product. So the first one is meaning the primary discourse is the historiography in the raw, and the second is the processed product. The existence of a chronological gap then is normal, because the primary primary discourse would be written at one point of time. A little later down the line, that would be consulted in order to create the secondary discourse. The readership is public and non-official for the secondary discourse. Like example is Mark Thornhill's magistrate. He was a magistrate of Mathura during the 1857 mutiny. The personal adventures and experiences material during the Sepoy Mutiny. So that's why these are secondary material. After the suppression of the, so I'm just quoting from Mark Thornhill a little bit. After the suppression of the Indian Mutiny, I commenced to write an account of my adventures. By the time my narrative was completed, the then interest of the public in the subject was exhausted. Like I said, the chronological distance is there. So the public had already lost interest in that event. Years have since passed and an interest of another kind has risen. And the events of that time have become history. And to that history, my story may prove a contribution. And I have therefore resolved to publish my narrative. But all said and done, Mark Thornhill belonged to the clan of colonizers. Shorn of contemporaneity, secondary discourse is thus recovered as an element of the past and classified as history. And what is the tertiary discourse? A tertiary discourse is a work of non-official writers who are no way connected to the British Raj or anybody symbiotically related to them or any historiographer. It is a work of non-official writers in most cases, or for officials no longer under any professional obligation or constraint to represent the standpoint of the government. So here, the standpoint of the government sometimes pales into insignificance because the writer is no longer obliged to represent the standpoint of the government. So a tertiary discourse would be based on the primary and the secondary discourse, but it has a mien of its own. Tertiary discourse is farther removed in time, often third person and non-official. There is also some tertiary discourse which aims to break away from the code of counter-insurgency. Counter-insurgency is against the insurgency, which means the British standpoint, and to adopt the point of view of the insurgents. So sometimes it does not talk for the British, and many a times it talks about the insurgents in a very sympathetic way. So this is an example. This is about the Santal Bidroho. Now, as a primary material, as a primary discourse, I am reading out a little bit of an excerpt from the Calcutta Review, who were talking for the British Raj. They should be surrounded and hunted, they meaning the Santals, should be surrounded and hunted up everywhere. That they should be compelled by force, if need be, to return to the Daminoko and to the wasted country in Bhagalpur and Birbhum, to rebuild the ruined villages, restore the desolate fields of cultivation, open roads, and advance general public works. Do this under watch and guard, and that this state of things should be continued until they are completely tranquilized and reconciled to their allegiance. So this is completely for the British Raj. The Santals should be just done away with, and they, whatever few are left of them, they should be, driven back to Bhagalpur and Birbhum from where they came, and they should cultivate the land, and they should do some public work under the British until they realize and they are, resigned to the fact that they have to go they have to reconcile to the allegiance of the British Raj. That was primary discourse, absolutely for the Raj. Then comes the secondary discourse, which is a little chronologically removed, but based on the primary discourse. The gentler
Aparajita, sorry to disturb you. 2 minutes, please. Wind up by 2 minutes.
Okay, sir. So I'll just try to skip through the quotations, and I'll try to go on into the next points that I want.
Sorry for the disturbance.
I understand. Yes. So this is a secondary discourse that is based on the primary discourse, and then comes the tertiary discourse, which is, we have this Bharate Krishak Bidroho, Ganatantrik Sangram, which gives you admiration, which gives you, a lot of adulation for the Santals. So this is the difference between the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary discourse. Now, representation as a blind spot. Where comes the blind spot? James Mill, sometimes when like I was saying, that Darstellen and Vertrethen, when you represent people from the outside, sometimes it can go terribly wrong. Like James Mill, he wrote out 6 volumes of the history of British India in 1826, and he never even visited India, just based on the volumes that Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India, along with William Jones and Nathaniel Brassey Halhed, had composed. He hadn't even visited India, and he wrote 6 volumes on the history of India. He himself said in the preface to the British history of British India that this writer, meaning himself, has never been in India, and if he has any, has a very slight and elementary acquaintance with any of the languages of the East, and he's representing the East. So there lies the irony of representation. Macaulay, I'm rushing through the slides, not reading out the total gamut of excerpts. Macaulay, in his Minutes upon Indian Education, which came out at the very famous or infamous writing, 2nd February 1835, I have just pointed out in blue. One look at this line in blue would suffice. A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. And this person who's talking himself confesses, I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic. And he has the cheek to say that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. And then there is this infamous pamphlet by the Orientalist Joseph Ernest Renan, who talks for colonialism as if it is a great boon on the colonized people. And he also makes a claim that the colonized people should be taxed for the fact that they are being kindly colonized by the whites, because the whites are carrying out the white man's burden to a T. Now, British literature or arts also justified. We know Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Even in game narratives, when you read, the narratives by Jim Corbett or Kenneth Anderson, you find this white man adulation always there. So that is the politics of representation. And what we need is a contrapuntal reading, taking the words of Edward Said. It's very necessary. Now, whenever we talk about a discourse, when you want to initiate a contrapuntal discourse, 3 things that need to come into fore is, if we follow what Foucault in the Archaeology of Knowledge talked about, he said that 3 things are necessary for a discourse to be initiated. 1, it cannot be a taboo. 2nd, the person who is initiating the discourse should not be dismissed as an insane person. Again, insanity is a discourse in itself, which is very, very relative. Galileo had one point at one point of time been called insane, and now we talk about different things. And institutional ratification is needed in order for a discourse to be initiated. But power and knowledge, again, taking Foucault into consideration, are very interrelated. Knowledge is always controlled by the institutionally superior. Therefore, the representation of the institutionally superior is more liable to be taken as authentic. So what happens in the process is the voice of the subaltern just gets choked because they are not institutionally superior. It never gains any agency, and the subaltern is never allowed to speak. Every cultural and epistemic bias then has to be deconstructed, and the privileged and the emphasized have to be deconstructed, and the subaltern, the underdog, the unprivileged need to have a representation in history. Okay, I'll just skip these a little bit. In Shipra Mukherjee's translation of Monoranjan Bapari's autobiographical novel, Interrogating an Chandal Life, an autobiography of the Dalit, Monoranjan Bapari says, I'm a Dalit by birth. Only a Dalit oppressed by social forces can experience true dolon in life. Dolon meaning oppression. We Bengalis can understand, meaning oppression. Similarly, unless the subaltern speaks, unless the subaltern speaks back, unless the empire speaks back, we will never have any idea about what they actually went through, what it is like to be colonized. Jane Anger had once, very, very early, in 1589, when she was writing a treatise which could be called one of the first treatises in feminism, she said something very interesting. She said, give me leave like a scholar to prove our wisdom more excellent. She was talking in the perspective of feminism, of course. She said, give me leave like a scholar to prove our wisdom and more excellent than us, that we are more witty, which comes by nature. It cannot be better proved than that by our answers. What she means to say is that give me agency, give me voice, let me write like the men, let me be a scholar like the men, and I can prove beyond doubt how much more witty women can be than men are, So the same thing could be said about the post-colonial history. Even oral history needs to be taken into account, because all of the world's subaltern expressions of their colonized existence is not written down. So oral history scholarship needs to be taken into account. Testimonial needs to be taken into account, which means the first person narration of a socially significant experiences of a typical or extraordinary witness or protagonist who metonymically represent others who have lived through similar situations. That person, maybe one person is writing the testimonial about his or her own experiences, but when that experience stands for the collective experience of a clan or a community or a subaltern group, then that testimonial needs to be taken into account. The empire then needs to write back. The subaltern needs to speak. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Professor Hazra. In this session, we have two very interesting papers, and I think both the papers will actually make us go into the thought processes of the speakers and follow the kind of discourses that they offered. The first speaker, Professor Jestrovich, approached the question of the authorship. And when you say authorship, you basically think in terms of authority. And she has proceeded to explain the process historically and pointed out the kind of shift that took place so far as authorship is concerned, so far as the power of authority is concerned. And she has very rightly pointed out that the entire process went through a shift. And as soon as she has also very interestingly pivoted her research in a very liminal kind of period when the historical time was changing. Historical time was changing in the context of technological innovations, where the changes were forced upon us, forced upon the reading public, the writing public, and therefore you see the kind of the concept of embodiment, which contains the concept of the power of the author himself or the herself, where the author's power is ingrained in the paper, in the paper where he signs, where he actually puts his signature on. That ultimately went through a change because there was a kind of democratization of the reading processes, the production processes. And the process actually introduced the printing presses, which is also a kind of impersonal process. And through this kind of a process, what happens is that there was a radical change in the reader's attitude, in the general attitude to the author himself or herself. Now, from you see the embodiment, there was a kind of textualization where you see a number of complex factors went on in dialogue with each other, where the authority of the author went on the wane, and therefore there was a very interesting kind of changes. And she has also in the context of brought in the concept of the death of the author, and therefore proceeded to give us some examples. So that her praxis actually was basically on Faust and Prospero as the two important characters whose authorship within the confines of the text she considered, and how the authorship was so much important, and how the authorship actually represented the greed for power in one character, and greed for power in a different sense, in the sense of colonization, in another character, Prospero, I mean. So from that point of view, she actually rounded up our questions and brought in the question of post-colonialism as well. Now, this is a wonderful presentation. I wish I had read her book. I have not, I will. And I can understand her point of view much better in that case. And I have my observation that since she has taken two dramatic texts, the genre is very, very important. And it is important to know how she thinks about the power of the author in terms of the characters she thinks about in the context of the play itself or the plays themselves, because the play is a kind of a site of posting of characters. So you see, the posting of characters is an act of power which is done by the author himself or herself. So how is that done? Because the genre of the drama or the play, also think in terms of relationship between characters. The characters which are posted, placed in dominant positions within the context, within the space of the text, and also some characters which are placed in the margin, and there are interactions between them. The question of the genre is therefore very, very important. So this is one paper, and I have this kind of observation about this one. About the second paper, which is also very important, which has presented some important discourse, I would say, aspects of discourse. Aparajita has basically approached the question of postcoloniality from the point of view of the subaltern, and from what she says from the point of view of the below. Okay, so basically she is thinking in terms of historiography, the historiography of the subaltern, historiography of the subaltern studies. And in this kind of historiography, what is important is that the return of the repressed must be done in a very effective way. And how can this be done? Okay, so who is actually representing? Because ultimately she brings in the question of representation. Who is representing? And is the representation authentic? So she has also referred to Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak and discussed a discourse. In this context, I think that the question, I personally believe that the question of the insiderness and the question of the outsiderness is not that much important in the context of representation. You will represent from your own point of view. There is no doubt about that. You have your own position, your own locality, your own class position, caste position, and you represent from that. But I would also like to mention what Gopal Guru has said in his wonderful book, Cracking the Mirror, in which his basic concept is that whatever might be your position, your locality, your locale in representation, what is important is the deletion of your position, your class position, etc. And a kind of empathy is very important in the reading of their context, the context that you are going to represent. So if you have empathy, if you erase your prejudicial points, prejudicial view, then you will be better positioned to represent whatever you want to represent. If you are somebody placed in a higher position, even then you can represent the subaltern. Maybe your representations are different, but nevertheless, it is representation and it should be given proper importance. Now, from this, she has moved on to the representation of insurgencies, and she has tapped on a very interesting kind of a field, which is the field of insurgency, which requires materials from archives. And she has done some archival studies, and she has brought in several comments from letters, several documents which are in the nature of letters or official documents. And in this context, she has also given the typologies of the materials as primary discourse, secondary discourse, and tertiary discourse. But she has also very interestingly pointed out the gaps in the representation, the gaps that your position can bring. Okay, these are the blind spots, and she has mentioned the history and the historiography of two persons, James Mill and Macaulay, whose positions were very, very prejudiced, okay, and very partial, of course. They didn't have the kind of insight into which might help reading the context of the other and the subaltern, the colonized, etc. So they didn't have empathy, the empathy which Gopal Guru has spoken of. And in this context, she also brings in she refers to Monoranjan Bapari, who is an insider and who thinks that his representation may be much more authentic because he is an insider. But interestingly, it's also that this book has to be translated, and this translation has been done by someone, Shipra Mukherjee, who does not belong to that class. Okay, so these are all very interesting questions which we may deal with later or during the course of question-answer session, comment sessions. Now, I will invite comments from the readers, and I hope there are comments. Let me read the comments and questions. On the comment that the subaltern has always been speaking, but that has never been heard, and the possibility of gaining agency by the oppressed under oppressive circumstances is the subaltern then dependent on the oppressor in a way to gain. I think this is not a question.
Yeah, observation.
Comment. Then I don't find any question.
Actually, sir, if I can just add to the wonderful summing up that you did just now. So when we talk about Gopal Guru, and when he talks about empathy, empathy is a very difficult term, because even when you empathize, it becomes very difficult to understand the perspective. Like when Sati Daha was happening, the white people empathized with the Sati. And when they were trying to save her, they represented it as the white man saving the brown woman from the brown man. And when the insiders, who felt for the Sati, they who were trying to bring forth the Sati Daha tradition, they were saying that the Sati wants to be a Sati. So, empathizing is very difficult. I mean, like you just very nicely pointed out, the gap in the representation is something that is very unnerving, and we would not know where to begin and where to finish, because had the colonizer not been had the colonizer not have had his hegemonic power structure perspective, then he wouldn't have been the colonizer at all. So kind of like it would defeat his aim to empathize with the colonized. Again, if the colonized people, if the colonized,
you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. But then you see that Gopal Guru, or even I, actually referring to the word empathy. Empathy is a very difficult word. Like all other abstract qualities, it is also a very difficult thing. But then you see, I refer to in the context of the representation. Okay, not in the context of administration, for example. You have the compulsions of making your policy, formulating your policies, and then you have at your back the colonial kind of ideology. So the British, in a way, looked at it from a different point of view. It was a different kind of a representation, of course. But then when I refer to representation, I obviously wanted that there should be some kind of insight into the condition of the object, of the person, which you are representing, which is an ethical act. And when you think in terms of ethical exercise, of course, you must have that kind of empathy, which would take you to the condition of the other. Okay, that is very important. And in this context, I made the comment, drawing my insight from Gopal Guru, of course.
I understand. It's a very
I don't
ideological point of view, and it would be so nice. It would be very good for history, for the history of mankind, if this could happen. But you know, like a pessimist, I sometimes feel that Gopal Guru's dream probably has a, you know, I don't know when it's going to be.
Now, how would you comment? What do you think about Marshata Devi's representation? Do you think that she has empathy? Do you
Yes.
think that she has
Marshata Devi
ethics?
has a lot of empathy for the community that she, so she has managed to master it. But you know, I don't know how.
That is the condition that one should try to achieve, I think, while you really represent.
True.
Now, I would request, since there is no other question, and if anyone has question, please write down in the chat box. And I would request Professor Jesrovic to make her comments, if she has any comment or observation to make in the context of the discussion that we have just now.
Thank you very much for a lovely presentation and and really excellent summary of both papers. Your point about genre is really important, and I must say I didn't think of it that much about it, and I think it's really important how these two authorial figures, if you look at Dr. Faustus and Prospero as two authorial figures, how the narrative plays out, and how their actions play out. So I just maybe like to say two things about that. One, to put what I was saying in a broader context of the book, is that I found Prospero and Faustus, among many other fictional and real authorial figures that I mentioned in the book, interesting because I'm looking at the cultural construction of the author. So again, maybe this brings us back to the question of authenticity. It's not like finding the authentic psychological authorial self, but it's more like how we see, how we represent the author communally or culturally or collectively. And one of the arguments here is that this has its own performativity. Performativity is sort of Austin's Judith Butler sense that words are actually doing, and in that sense. So I was exploring that construction of the author and deconstruction of the author through the various post-colonial writing back and discourses, and also performing back. And again, something that also Professor Hazra has mentioned, the language and the performativity of language and what language does. So in her context, obviously it was a different context. It was an insurgency context, a political context, but also in terms of cultural hegemony and how you actually conquer through culture. The question of genre is very interesting because it made me think how one chooses the genre. When writing, or if you interpret this on stage, or if you do an intertextual rendering of whether the Tempest or Dr. Faustus, and what does this choice consciously or subconsciously brings? So Dr. Faustus, obviously a tragedy. So there is a dilemma there on this cusp of this man who is sort of doing something transgressive. Right, he's authoring at the moment where in European history, the key author is God, so he's taking the role, right? Whereas in the other one, which the Tempest, which we can read contextually very much as a play that kind of grapples with basically discovering of the new world, and that colonial conquest that has been started. It's written in a genre of comedy. There is a happy ending is guaranteed. So all that voyage, all that travel, in spite of injustices and turmoils and storms, will end well, because there is this big figure of a magician, this and it's a white man, happens to be, because that. So I think this is something for me to think about, how genres are chosen. And the other comment I want to make concerns, it's not so much about this, but what you were talking about, and I don't so much know the historical material, I don't know it at all, but the question of representation and the Darstellen and Verstellen. And I'm wondering whether this, and this is from another sort of trajectory of my work, as somebody who is working very much in the context of exile, for example. I done some work on that, and I'm wondering, is there a position, is there a position in between? And again, from a very different context, it's not really a colonial or post-colonial context, but as somebody coming from former Yugoslavia that fell apart, and I emigrated and all of that. And I've written another book that had to do with cities, and had to do with Belgrade, which is my own city, and Sarajevo, which is a city that was part of Yugoslavia, but it's not my own, and Serbs are bombing it, not to get into this history. So that question of where am I? Am I Darstellen or Vorstellen? Am I the insider or am I the outsider? So I thought, okay, for some of these, I'm the insider because I was part of some of this, for protests or whatever. But from others, and it's not a class, it's not from a caste perspective, but from a different perspective of political resistance. But for the other one, let's say the Sarajevo one, I wasn't there when it was happening. I was looking, so I said, but still, I'm part of that language, culture to some extent. So I call myself an intimate outsider. So I'm wondering whether there is a positionality in between that has some epistemological potential. Yeah, so that's my.
Okay, thank you very much. I think
I see one more question over here from Shubhendu Vishash to everyone.
Please read and
So because it says Shubhendu Vishash to everyone, but at the last, in parenthesis, there is this line, my question to respected Aparajita ma'am. So Aparajita ma'am is answering.
please.
So the question is the representation by the subaltern be called a sort of fragmented stories within quotes, linking to postmodernism aspect of fragmented individual narrative than central totality? Yeah, very good question. Who is Shubhendu Vishash? Yes.
Ma'am, I am Subhendu Vishal hosting the session, ma'am.
Okay, great. So
Hosting the session.
Great. So Shubhendu, thank you for that question. Now I would like to, immediately refer to Jean-François Lyotard, and in his postmodern condition, he talks about how the meta narratives are just not working out nowadays. So the meta receipt is not working out. So petite receipt is the, the word of the day. So yes, you're right that we don't talk about reason anymore. We talk about reasons, right, with a plural, with an S. So these reasons will only come across when we talk about the petite receipt, the all those small stories, as you call them. So all those stories brought together instead of the grand meta narrative of historiography. True enough. Yes, thank you for the question.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
I think we should stop here, no?
Yes,
yes, sir. Now I would like to give vote of thanks. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Before that, thank both the speakers. Wonderful presentations.
Thank you, sir.
And I enjoyed it very much. I now hand over the microphone to the organizers.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for chairing this session with such an insightful way. Thanks also to respected Silvija Jestrovic ma'am and respected Aparajita Hajra ma'am. Stay safe and healthy, all of you, in this pandemic situation. Thank you again, and well wishes for all of you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us over. Thank you,
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Goodbye, ma'am. Goodbye.
Hello. Should I start presenting my presentation?
Tonmoy, are you here? Tonmoy?
Yes, I can hear you. Diktop Kole, please turn on your video first. I'm not able to bring you to the spotlight.
Yes, I have turned on my video. Hello.
Rector, you carry on.
Can you hear me?
May I?
Yes, yes, you carry on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I, Rekta Shoren, on behalf of New Literaria, an international journal of interdisciplinary studies in humanities, in collaboration with the Department of English, Assam University, welcome you all in this 3-day international e-conference on rethinking the post-colonial texts and contexts. Today is the second day, and in this session, we have among us a great savant, Dr. Ashok Kumar Mahapatra, as the chairperson. Dr. Mahapatra is a professor at the Department of English, Sambalpur University, Odisha. He was a Fulbright Fellow at Columbia and Yale University. The fields of his research are language and cultural studies, as well as post-colonial studies. Having a prolonged 35 years teaching career, he guided over 65 MPhil students and 6 PhD scholars. From authoring books and monographs like Stylistic Criticism of Modern Oriya Poetry to translating, he showed each and every time how creative and magnificent his works are. He is surely a paragon at what he does. We are blessed to have such a pantomath among us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Am I
Yes, sir.
audible? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure, although we are slightly late. So without much ado, let's get to business. How many papers do we have today? Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how many papers we have.
So
And
for about 6.
about 6. And how much time do we have? Now
The
it's
10 minutes is allotted for every participant.
okay. So without much ado, let's call the first. I guess somebody is beside me to help me out to call these participants. I simply don't have. It's very difficult to. It's slightly. It's a different ball game to organize seminars in this mode. So please call whoever is the first one and let him or her read the paper.
So shall I call or you will call them?
No, because I'm not in a position. I don't know who the people are, nor do I know them. They have not been introduced to me. So you better actually call them.
Okay,
That's
sir.
how we are going to go about it.
Okay, sir. So I'll take a minute. Okay. Our first participant is Dharmi Pegu.
Okay. Let this person introduce
absent.
himself or herself a little. Then okay.
She's absent. Sir, Tanmoy, yes, sir. So she is absent today.
Okay, sure. No problem. Let's move on to the next speaker.
Yes.
Sir, our second presenter is Anuja Mandal.
Okay. Yeah, Anuja, please come and introduce yourself if you're around.
She's also absent.
Who are present? You You are not in a position to know well. Okay, go on.
Next is Saurav Das.
Good afternoon, sir. Good
Good evening.
afternoon,
Yeah, sort of.
dear
Okay.
members. Yeah, I am Shourav Das. I am a doctoral scholar at the St. Xavier's University, Kolkata, and I will be presenting my paper with all of your with your permission, which has to do with the identity of in evaluation of the identity of Caribbean diasporic bodies. So, with your permission, I shall then start
Yes, go ahead.
presenting. Thank you, sir. So the title of my paper is The Postcolonial Condition, situating the pathos of Caribbean diasporic identity. And I'm starting. Theorization of diaspora has throughout stressed on the uprootedness of people, character, and communities as a whole, and evaluated the politics of identity from the viewpoint of this uprootedness. This stress on the uprooted nature on the body simultaneously then validates the presumption of an origin in the first place. This outlook on the question of identity of diasporic bodies leads to the presumption that once if the migrant is able to make his, her, or their journey back home, back to their strong center, and I quote William Safran's essay, Diaspora in the Modern Society, Myths of Homeland and Return, strong center, the cultural alienation they had been projected to would be overturned into a sense of cultural affinity. Their lost and forgotten identity would be reclaimed again. In this paper, I intend to stress on the period after the return of the migrants and evaluate the question of identity, taking into account two novellas, Carol Phillips' A State of Independence and Abdurrazak Gurna's Admiring Silence. Phillips' A State of Independence tells the story of a young man from the Caribbean island of St. Kitts and Nevis who makes the long journey to England on a scholarship to study law. His St. Kitts and Nevis, ironically, is shackled in the yoke of British colonialism. Baba comments that any form of colonialism is dependent on a systematically created order of otherness that objectifies the native, giving them an identity through a difference from the colonizer. This Lacanian othering of the native plants in them the desire for mimicry, to mimic the seat of power in an attempt to find parity. We go further when Foucault opines that mimicry is always leads with repetition, what he calls iteration. He points out that every form of mimicry gives a space, if only a very minute one, for the birth of agency. In every repetition, there is difference. Baba takes this further when he comments that this opening for agency has the potential to problematize the colonizer. Bertram Francis, the protagonist of our novella, A State of Independence, he exercises just that. He's a good student. He competes for a British scholarship against white English competitors, and he attains it. Bertram's agency not only makes his colonizers anxious, but also subverts the binary of the foolish native narrative. The colonized Bertram desires an autonomy of identity, and the knowledge of his othering leads him to the realization that autonomy can only be attained via the trope of the colonizer. But reaching England, Francis discovers the bitter truth that his agency is nothing but a subtle hegemonic manipulation by his proverbial masters. And herein lies, I think, the problem that Baba may have overlooked, is that mimicry does allow the subject agency for subversion, but this should always be remembered that the anxiety of the colonizer, and when I say anxiety of the colonizer, I am again referring to Fano's academia, that the colonizer also faces a certain anxiety. The anxiety of the colonizer, is always attempting to limit the agency through the controlled proliferation of some authority, which they feel is sufficient to give the native a false sense of power and autonomy. Gurna's novella, Admiring Silence, offers quite a similar story. The unnamed narrator leaves his native land of colonial Zanzibar and makes the voyage across the seas to the heart of power and authority in order to gild himself an identity that would allow him to express his autonomy. The narrator tries to mold a life for himself there, living, working, marrying, and even fathering a girl child. Where Bertram fails massively, Gurna's protagonist tries and tries hard to assimilate. But at 42, the narrator is estranged from his wife Emma, their daughter. He abhors his teaching job and has a dicey heart. Both Bertram and Gurna's unnamed narrator mistake the agency allowed to them as self-actualization. The angst of these characters stem from being consistently alienated, their agency subverted. Home did not feel like home because of the constant colonial menace, while the land across the seas just did not become home. This is important here. Even though Bertram exhibited a stoic disposal to England, Gurna's unnamed narrator actively tried his hand and his luck, most importantly, at assimilation. While Bertram's effort at self-actualization failed, so did the attempts at assimilation for Gurna's narrator. Their return marks the most interesting part of their life story. The anxiety for affinity is heightened many folds when they realize that home is not what it was, or more importantly, what they had imagined or expected it to be. Their home, in their absence, has undergone a sea change. The islands have become independent, not through armed struggle, but through negotiation. The very fabric of society has changed. To Bertram and Gurna's narrator, their native land freed from the colonial yoke seems to offer a perfect opportunity to feel whole again. But the position of their homeland post-independence is an uncanny one. The shift from the colonized to independent is not one of native cultural truths and purity as they had thought and expected it to be. On the contrary, it is a chain of events characterized by mixture and manipulation as the main ingredients. The uncanny characterizes the dual nature of the islands' identity, what Bhabha terms as the post-colonial condition. The natives themselves have been hybridized into capitalist post-colonial beings who have fought for the reins of their country amongst themselves by molding oneself into the best mimic of the colonizer. And power is handed down to them through very careful negotiation. Phillips and Gurna's characters believe home to be an essentialized land where it turns out, where in reality, it turns out to be exactly the opposite. In their absence, home has shifted paradigms, being structured and restructured. The characters, very much like Thamma in Ghosh's Shadow Lines, continue to keep believing in an essentialized notion of home and by extension, identity. They, just like Thamma, believe that order is the border is a physical entity, a boundary that binds a group of essentialized cultural notions, which result in the creation of a common identity. The post-colonial condition of Bertram Francis's Caribbean island home and the unnamed narrator's Zanzibar challenges all notions of essentialist claims for inherent authenticity or purity of cultures. Bertram's childhood friend is now an administrator in the new government, a government that is only Caribbean in name but British in flavor. In case of Gurna's narrator, consequences are quite the same. Even though he is accepted back into the family, it is not without reservations. Autonomy still haunts him, as he has to sugarcoat his British experiences to get accepted. He brings gifts to appease his family and friends and to smoothen his passage into his homeland. But his presence, comprising of luxury goods like chocolates and fashion accessories, are blatantly disregarded by his family, who desire rice and sugar over these. Freedom came, but the post-colonial condition of the island has enabled the prevailing of the gulf between the social classes. In both cases, self-dependence comes with a covert imperialist shadow. The middle and the upper classes who derive their livelihoods from the colonial coffers now run the country, being the best mimics, while the lower sections still grind under the oppression and inequality. The difference in the positioning of the two families lead them to react differently to the returns, but essentially, we find out that the gross reaction, the grand reaction, is the same. It's one of rejection. Again, I am quoting Dylan Brown I'm quoting from Dylan Brown's essay, A State of Independence, Carol Phillips and the Post-War World Order, where he says that Bertram's escapist fantasy of a personal autonomy is conceived provocatively in geographical terms. This is very significant in the context of this. Both Bertram and Gurna's narrator continue to be in the limbo that they so ardently wanted to escape. The liminal positions that they found themselves in by the end of the stories almost get multiplied manifolds as home itself becomes alien. Home as a geographical space that hallmarks certain qualities for both is problematized and subverted. The conclusion is different for either. While Gurna's narrator, accepting his ever liminal position between the two worlds, between two peoples, between two places, and two identities, essentially two identities, returns back to England almost mechanically, not knowing what else to do or where else to go. Bertram Francis, on the other hand, still has not been able to overcome the shock of it all. He roams the street of his island home like a ghost, unable to perceive, unable to think, unable to act. Their return highlights their perennial centerless condition. It is the return which situates the pathos of their ever liminal identity. There is no center, just peripheries that are getting shaped and reshaped endlessly. To them, the world seems to be a weak periphery as the strong center, again in quotes, has slipped and continues slipping. To them, I quote Yeats's Second Coming, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosened around the world. Thank you, that will be all. That is all from me.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Saurabh. All right. Are we supposed to take the questions after individual paper or after all the papers have been presented? What is your way of going about things?
At the end of the session, we can have an interactive session.
Okay, in that case, let's move on to the next speaker.
Next, we have Sakshi Dagar.
Okay,
Yeah.
Sakshi.
Hello, good evening, I'm here.
Sorry.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay, so I'm Sakshi Dagar. I have done my graduation and post-graduation from University of Delhi. Currently, I'm pursuing a PhD. And this is the first time that I'll be presenting a paper. So do excuse me if I make any mistakes, because there are many. After hearing Mr. Anuj, I could, make sense that my paper holds no weight in front of his. So, but still, I like to.
You were doing your PhD at University of Delhi.
No, sir. I've done my graduation and post-graduation from University of Delhi, but I'm pursuing my PhD from a private university because I'm working simultaneously.
Achha, which university is that?
Sir, it's in Rohtak, Haryana. It's I'm even ashamed of taking its name.
Of course not. Why on earth would you be ashamed of?
Because it's a private university.
So what? Private universities, some of them are very good. Ashoka University is one of the very best.
No, but because it's not Ashoka. Otherwise, I would have said it.
Okay, all right. I mean,
yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Okay, so I'll go ahead with the paper. So the title of my paper is Diaspora Creates Multiple Identities. So it's an analysis of the namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. I know it's a topic which you must have heard everywhere. So yeah, I'll start with it. The novel opens with Ashima Ganguly standing in the kitchen of a Central Square apartment, wishing there were mustard oil to pour into the mix. For an Indian, mustard oil is no luxury. In fact, it is one of the commonest edible oil to be found in each and every general store over here. Lahiri has taken us back to the America of 1970s. It is the time when the globe was yet to embrace globalization, and immigrants every now and then miss their homelands for particular spices, herbs, and food items which were impossible to be found in the new land. The idea of cultural dislocation sits heavy on the minds of immigrants who go to the promised land in search of better opportunities. But these opportunities come with the hefty price of unstable identities, restlessness, and cultural mutation. The namesake is more than a book about a name. It is about finding identity in a country that treats one as an alien, even if they were born there. But more than that, it is about rediscovering their roots in the accidents of the universe that caused it to be. I'm specifically talking about the train accident. The novel shuttles back and forth between India and America in Ashima and Ashok's memories. Ashima and other migrants treat their stay in the second or the other country as an exile, which will be over later, if not sooner. They try to keep alive in exile a strong sense of what home is like and try to maintain a cultural identity. Despite being in America, Ashima clings to her saris from Murshidabad. While waiting for her delivery at the hospital, the first thought which crosses her mind is, if she is the only Indian person in the hospital. In India, women go home to their parents to give birth, away from husbands and in-laws, and household cares, retreating briefly to childhood when the baby arrives. She is petrified with the thoughts of motherhood in a foreign land. The omniscient narrator tells us she is terrified to raise a child in a country where she is related to no one, where she knows so little, where life seems so tentative and spare. Her fear also arises from the fact that she does not want her children to be like other kids who address their elders with names and show little respect. It is not surprising to see an old copy of Desh magazine as a site of perpetual comfort to her amidst the cold of America. Stuart Hall, in his essay, the name of the essay is Thinking the Diaspora, says, in the diaspora situation, identities become multiple. Alongside an associative connection with a particular island home, there are other centripetal forces. And we see those centripetal forces like the Bengaliness and the Indianness of Ashok and Ashima Ganguly, which they share with other Bengalis and Indian migrants, is quite different from their bond with the Montgomerys, the Nandis, and the Guptas, who usher Gogul and Ashima in the best possible way to make them not feel lost and untrue. However, Ashima does not fail to realize that these people are just the substitutes for the people who really ought to be surrounding her kids. George Lemming once remarked that his generation became West Indians not in the Caribbean but in London. The narrator in the namesake tells us the husbands are teachers, researchers, doctors, engineers, the wives homesick and bewildered. They turn to Ashima for recipes and advice, and she tells them about the carp that's sold in Chinatown, that is possible to make halwa from cream of wheat. The families drop by one another's homes on Sunday afternoons. They sit in circles on the floor, singing songs by Nazrul and Tagore, passing a thick yellow cloth-bound book of lyrics among them as Dilip Nandi plays the harmonium. They argue righteously over the films of Ritvik Ghatak versus those of Satyajit Ray, the CPIM versus the Congress Party, North Calcutta versus South. For hours, they argue about politics of America, a country which none of them is eligible to vote in. It is in Cleveland that they sit and try to savor their nationality. For them, India can exist only in India, and they see themselves as exiled beings, sitting on the other side of border and reminiscing about the good old times. In reality, it is a conscious decision made by each of them to make the most out of resources and opportunities. They totally negate Benedict Anderson's idea of nations not only being sovereign political entities, but imagined communities too. Also, where do the boundaries begin and end, where regionally everyone is historically and culturally so closely related to its neighbors, and so many live thousands of miles from home? These Indian families build a catacomb to hide their inability to trust and mingle with people of other races, and hence maintain a safe distance, sticking to their nostalgia or holding hard on to it. For Ashima, it is the hardest to spend her day in that apartment, wrapped away from both the cultures. She pictures the black iron bars in the windows of her parents' flat and Gogul in his American baby clothes and diapers, playing beneath the ceiling fan on her parents' four-poster bed. She misses India miserably. To her, America remains a stranger for most part of her life. She is reluctant to introduce stuff from yard sales into her household, which other Americans do nonchalantly. She finds it disgusting to use objects shunned by Americans. To a casual observer, the Gangulis, apart from the name on their mailbox, apart from the issues of India abroad and Sangbad Vichitra that are delivered there, appear no different from their neighbors. But even before the Gangulis realized it, they started adjusting well with the culture and custom of America for the sake of their children. They decorate Christmas tree, they put wreath on the door, decorate and paint boiled eggs for Easter. So the American way of living starts to appeal. They appreciated the fact that it is only in this country that lost things could be collected from the lost and found desk. For Gogol's sake, I may be pronouncing the name wrong, I'm not Bengali. For Gogol's sake, Ashima learns to cook American food like shake and bake chicken once in a week. 2 birthday celebrations were organized, one for the American classmates who prefer pizza and ice cream, and the second one for the Indian friends who look forward to gatherings with desi music and food. Ashok, on the other hand, shows acclimatization by shunning away the lifelong trustworthy tailor-made pants and shirts and learns to buy ready-made. Here, I would like to bring in associational identification. It is the phenomenon in which the culture of origin remains strong, even into the second and third generation, though the places of origin are no longer the only source of identification. This brings us to the need which made Ashima and Ashok to send their kids to Bengali language and cultural lessons, because whenever the parents closed their eyes, it unsettled them that their children sound just like Americans, expertly conversing in a language that still at times confounds them, in accents they are accustomed not to trust. These children have no liking for syrupy Rosgullas. Birth of Christ brought more fanfare than Durga or Saraswati Puja. Their trip to India comes as a shocking revelation about their roots. Trams, buses, chalked congested streets, and beggars are a sight of horror to them. They are scared to see their parents talking loudly with relatives who call them with their dark name. The trip to India is quickly forgotten by the kids as soon as they return to America. And so the 8 months are put behind them, quickly shed, quickly forgotten, like clothes worn for a special occasion or for a season that is past, suddenly cumbersome, irrelevant to their lives. On the other hand, a real time example of associational identification, which I had been very fond of, is Superwoman. But she goes by the name Lily Singh, and she's a YouTube sensation. Her parents migrated to Canada in 1970s, where she was born and brought up. Her Canadian accent does not hinder her from inculcating Bhangra, Punjabi slangs, Indian anecdotes, and Bollywood references in her posts, which makes it easy for her Indian fans to relate to. Most of her videos talk about the experiences of South Asian immigrants in foreign lands. Her videos featuring comparison between white and brown people are possible only due to the hybrid position that she is in. She has seen the best and the worst of both the worlds. She identifies herself with both the countries and speaks Hindi, Tamil, Punjabi as fluently as British English and takes pride in the Harlem she has been brought up in. So, the introduction in Homi Bhabha's book, The Location of Culture, expounds Superwoman's belief further, as it says, what is theoretically innovative, I'm quoting, what is theoretically innovative and politically crucial is the need to think beyond narratives of originary and initial subjectivities, and to focus on those moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural differences. These in-between spaces provide the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity and innovative sites of collaboration and contestation in the act of defining the idea of society itself. Similarly, Stuart Hall says, and I quote, our societies are composed not of one, but of many people. Their origins are not singular, but diverse. Those to whom the land originally belonged have long since largely perished, decimated by hard labor and disease. Instead of the slowly evolving pact of civil association, so central to the liberal discourse of Western modernity, a civil association was inaugurated by an act of imperial will. The pathway to our modernity is marked out by conquest, expropriation, genocide, and slavery. Same applies to America. It has a history of its own. Edward Braithwaite re-examines the truth behind the established image of Columbus, the discoverer, in his poem Columb, or Columbi, suggesting both the French for dove and the French version of Columbus' surname, the French version of Columbus' surname. This also brings us to the question as to why it is said that America was discovered, when America has been there at its location since ages. Columbus' arrival unleashes violence and terror on the natives who were forced to migrate and opened a path for the exploitation of the Americas by Europe and slavery in the West Indies. Chitra Banerjee Devakurni, in her poem Indian Movie New Jersey, talks about the safe, secluded moments which Indians and for that matter other immigrants enjoy in a movie theater away from the prying and condescending eyes of the Americans. The lines, and I'm quoting her, the poem basically, the flickering movie light wipes from our faces ears of America. Sons who want mohawks, the hairstyle, and refuse to run the family store, daughters who date on the sly. Helps us to draw parallel with the life of Gogol, Shonali, and Moshmi. We see that Gogol is not content with the name given by his parents. He finds it hard to relate to Nikolai Gogol and feels embarrassed whenever his name becomes a topic of discussion. He does not realize that it was more because of his childish whims due to which he retained the name Gogol. We observed that the two second-generation Bengali girls in the text are infatuated by guys of different racial backgrounds. Gogol beds and dates Ruth, Maxine, and a few other girls before marrying Moshmi. These kids are outsider to both cultures. They are neither Desis nor full Americans. To them, India is not their desh. It is just a country, like other countries in the world. The abbreviation ABCD, and you might find it funny, it stands for American Born Confused or Conflicted Desi, explains their situation in short. We can also decipher that the parents and Gogol are somewhere going through the same situation. Gogol doesn't like what his parents gave him and wants to change it, and in avoiding questions pertaining to his name and to his namesake, he is escaping its shadow and is running away from it. The parents, on the other hand, are trying to escape the present. They seek refuge in the letters bearing Indian stems, names, and addresses. Both feel uprooted. While Ashok has established a good reputation with his students and colleagues, Ashima, in order to keep herself busy, takes up a job in the library. This not only gives her a sense of contentment, but also gives her the opportunity to make friends beyond the Indian circle. Ashima does not raise any objection about Sonia and Ben's wedding because Gogol's and Moshmi's marriage failed despite both being Bengalis. This incident assisted her in spreading her horizon. Names and their meanings are very vital to the plot of this novel. The name Ashima, literally meaning the one with no boundaries or no seemas, is true to her very being. After Ashok's death, she gives up her flat at Pemberton Road and decides to live 6 months of her life in Calcutta with her younger brother Rana and dividing the rest of the 6 months among Sonia, Gogol, and her Bengali friends in America. She will be without borders, without a home of her own, a resident everywhere and nowhere. The globalized citizen, as we call it these days. This not only makes her a citizen of both the countries, but also makes her a hybrid. She, in true sense, carries resonance of both the cultures in her soul. India, no doubt, is a place which is ever available to her to escape the dreariness of Cleveland. But a refusal to shift her base back to India after Ashok's death signifies the importance and value of the place where her husband established himself as an academician, her children were born, and where the family lived for 25 whooping years. She feels overwhelmed by the thought of the move she is about to make to the city that was once home and is now in its own way foreign. Though his ashes have been scattered into the Ganges, it is here, in this house and in this town, that he will continue to dwell in her mind. We see that for 33 years she longed to go back to India. She felt something vital missing in her all the time, but when she finally leaves for India, it pains her to sell her house and part with things that constituted her house and life at large. Though she doesn't feel fully at home within these walls of Pemberton Road, she knows that this is home nevertheless. So I would finally like to conclude with Homi Bhabha's words from his essay titled Postcolonial Criticism. Culture is translational because such spatial histories of displacement, now accompanied by the territorial ambitions of global media technologies, make the question of how culture signifies or what is signified by culture a rather complex issue. It becomes crucial to distinguish between the semblance and similitude of the symbols across diverse cultural experiences, literature, art, music, ritual, life, death, and the social specificity of each of these productions of meaning as they circulate as signs within specific contextual locations and social systems of value. The transitional dimension of cultural transformation, be it migration, diaspora, displacement, relocation, makes the process of cultural translation a complex form of signification. The strength of umbilical tie cannot be overruled. Ashima's decision to spend 6 months in India is a testimony of the same. But it is also true that returnees find it extremely difficult to reconnect with the place and society of their birth. They miss the humdrum of busy urban and fast paced life offered by the developed countries. They find it extremely hard to acclimatize with the air, ambience, water, and food of the developing nations. They find their home completely changed from the home that was there in their memories, and it becomes hard for them to associate and find a place to fit into. Cultural hybridities makes them rethink the questions of identity and national affiliation. That was all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shikha.
Sakshi.
Sakshi, okay. Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, so who is the next one?
Next is Deepta Kole.
Okay, all right.
Good morning, sir, and people present. My name is Jittak Kole, and I'm an undergraduate student of BA English Honours from Amity University, Calcutta. And I want to pursue I want to become an academic research scholar in post-colonial literature and especially diasporic literature. So I made a presentation, so I hope it would be better to share the presentation. Should I go forward, sir?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so basically the paper that I've written is exploring the aspects of geosocial politics and identity politics in diasporic literature through Aga Shahid Ali's poems in the collection The Half-Inch Himalayas. So talking briefly about the poet Aga Shahid Ali, he is one of the canons of Indian Kashmiri diasporic poetry. Born in a highly educated and intellectual family from Kashmir, he was educated in a convent school, and his education took place half in India and half in the US. And he had a very secular and liberal approach towards politics and life. Though he had spent very less time in Kashmir, Aga Shahid Ali was deeply attached to his homeland and was rather sentimental, as described by his friends and family. Nirja Matto, in her essay, Aga Shahid Ali, As I Knew Him, had talked about how he was sentimental about a plate of Rogan Josh and how it could break or make his mood depending upon the way it was made. Aga Shahid Ali was diagnosed with brain cancer in the early 2000s, and he died in 2001, October. Though he had wanted to come back to India during his when he was diagnosed with cancer, his steady deterioration in his health did not allow him to do so, and he was he was buried in Amherst, Massachusetts. So, coming to the work that I have taken into consideration, Half Inch Himalayas was a stellar collection of poems by Aga Shahid Ali that was published in the year 1987. One of his most famous poems, Postcard from Kashmir, which is considered as which can be considered as his magnum opus, a poem that talks about his feelings for Kashmir, where he describes Kashmir not just as a place, not just as a homeland, but as a character, something that someone rather with whom he connects and with whom he is so emotionally attached. The way he describes his emotions in the poems, though a very short poem, is something that is very beautiful to look at. Other poems in the collection, such as Snowman, where he talks about his ancestral legacy and how he is willing to lay it at stake for the peace and prosperity of Kashmir, is something that can also be taken into consideration. It gives a insight into the geosocial and ancestral identity. Then he had poems like Homage to Faiz Ahmad Faiz and in memory of Begum Akhtar, where he refers to artists from Kashmir and India to whom he had been so attached and who had inspired him so much, which gives again a very unique humane diaspora in his work. Coming to the part where I discuss about his works and the geosocial and identity politics that are related to this, Aga Shahid Ali despised the politicization of poetry. In an essay by Amitav Ghosh on the death of Aga Shahid Ali, he had written about how ironic it was that his work he used to despise the political nature that was sometimes given to poetry or the political mobilization of poetry. And he used to think that art should not be made for a agenda. But however, when he talks about when there is a political tinge in his poetry about Kashmir, we should understand that it was not his political stance, but rather his cry, so that cry to people to free his homeland or the place which was once considered as a paradise on earth from the hotbed of, of political discourse that it had become, where regional, religious and communal hatred used to run the place. So Ali also condemned the partition of India, and he had given in various occasions he had talked about how it had led to the deterioration of Kashmir that had happened. Coming to the identity politics, Aga Shahid Ali considered himself a triple exile, as he had talked about it in many places and in many interviews. He was extremely sentimental about his Kashmiri identity, and it's said that he often used to visit his parents in Kashmir. Most of Aga Shahid Ali's works revolve around Kashmir and only around Kashmir. Uh, and they are like a genuine effort to make his culture, which is so very secluded, which is something that's so very hard to access, accessible to the entire world. Kashmir plays a very dynamic character in almost all his poems. Many critics are of the opinion that the way he described Kashmir as a peaceful place which had been turned into a place of bloodshed and gore was something that came from his deep insecurity regarding his national identity. His poems unveil a certain pain and agony that one experiences when something or someone very near to them collapses while one watches helplessly. Coming to the last part, where I talk about the relevance of Aga Shahid Ali's works in modern day Kashmir, we all know about the condition of Kashmir in today's world. And it's kind of very painful to watch it, especially when we have read the works of canon of Kashmiri poetry like Aga Shahid Ali. Though he had breathed his last almost 2 decades ago, his poems are subsequently relevant in today's Kashmir, which is a hotbed of communal politics fueled by communal and religious fundamentalism. His works, which are a cry to restore Kashmir to its previous peace and
If there is some problem, network problem, it seems.
some problem that I was facing.
Yeah.
Sorry, sir. Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. So, yeah, talking about the way his work was a cry to restore Kashmir to its previous peace and beauty, sir. Even if his work was written at a time when the whole dynamics of Indian politics was extremely different considered to what it is today. Like it was a time when there was a part of the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits. I think that it's very fundamental to see that it's something that has remained because it's not about the oppressor or the oppressed that he talked about, but he talked about the way his homeland, Kashmir, was being condemned and how it had become a because the place cannot be blamed for what it is. It's the people of the place who had brought it, the people of the place or the people related to the place who had brought the kind of political agony that was there. And I think that's especially what Aga Shahid Ali had played against that to be stopped, and that is something that we can again see. He had translated the works of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, which is very well known. I think the collection is called "Call Me Ishmael Tonight," and I think and the poems from there like "Hum Dekhenge" are something that have become the voice of dissent and protest against the atrocities committed against Kashmir. Thank you, sir. That would be all that I have to say. Uh,
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Deepak. Deeptak. Okay, all right. Now, any other presenter? Who else is there? Anybody else?
Thank you, sir.
All right, now can we move on to the next speaker if there is any? Oh, Ashapurna there. All right. Yeah.
Am I audible, sir? Good afternoon, sir.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm audible. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. I am Ashapurna Das, working as an assistant professor in Veer Surendra Sai University of Technology, Bulla. I am a student of Professor Mahapatra. So, sir, I always get nervous in front of you because I'm grown up in front of you. I am still a student in front of you, sir. So
Okay.
today I'm going to present a paper on the title Representing Fragmented Identity in Mina Alexander's Autobiographical Text, a Study in Postcolonial Context. Now I'm actually, sir, reading my paper. The postcolonial era has given rise to a group of diaspora writers who leave their native place and settle in a foreign land. These diaspora writers are emerged out of migration, sometimes imposed, sometimes voluntary. They write such narratives which focus on the trauma of dislocation, suffering of separation, and loss of homeland. The notion of a dispersed, fluctuating, shifting, and above all, discursively constructed selfhood works its way into the writings of these post-colonial writers. The idea of self is more problematic with such writers, which is portrayed as split, cracked, fragmented, and hyphenated. Many Indian women writers like Anita Desai, Bharati Mukherjee, Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, Sasi Deshpande, Manju Kapoor, Jhumpa Lahiri, and Meena Alexander have contributed to the category of post-colonial writings focusing on the issues of self-assertion, identity, multiple migrations, and border crossings. Today, I am going to focus on Meena Alexander's autobiographical writings, Fault Lines, a memoir, and The Shock of Arrival, where he problematizes the concept of self by introducing the idea of division and fragmentation. Meena Alexander never experienced a fixed identity in terms of community, society, and nation, as her location was frequently structured, restructured, and negotiated by different places, languages, and cultures due to her father's transfer, for higher studies, for jobs, and eventually for her marriage. She struggled between her actual self and the self constructed by others. She used writing as a therapeutic measure to represent her inner torment. So mostly her life narrative reflects all these things. So the trauma of migration, alienation, and uprootedness, the major issues focused in her life narratives. Through these narratives, she presents herself as an individual who is continuously searching for a stable anchorage. She is trying to find a firm ground and trying to carve out a space of her own. She experiences multiple places, staying in one place. She feels the presence of her earlier surroundings, irrespective of her present location. In her words, it is summer in Manhattan and a hot wind blows. The wind blows in through the window. I feel against my cheeks almost as if I were in Khartoum or Tiruvalla. So in the memories, she tries to minimize the gap between different places. While in New York, she remembers her Hyderabad days, and she tries to cover over the gap through a leap of her imagination. Alexander feels very disheartened in her divided state. She is unable to position herself in a fixed place. In such mental trauma, with utmost despair, she wishes herself to be a non-living. She has used very nice imagery in these life narratives. To be a non-living entity, a stone, which is without any emotion and sentiment. She anticipates herself to be a dead stone because her frequent portability would not hurt her. To quote her, if I were a stone, Amma could so easily pick me up, and surely she should. Tucking me into her bag, she would make off in great haste, leaping into a metal body that traveled a great speed over crossroads, boundaries of nations, oceans, cutting from houses to houses, state to states, never stopping, never resting. My stony self, bound always in her bag, held in a metallic thing with wings, steam puffing as we moved over earth, sky, water. Alexander is assailed by images from the past and is alert to the pulse of present experiences. In such ambiguous states, she is unable to relate to stable access of time and space. She faces the after effects of a divided existence. At times, her past memories and present memories get jumbled up. This existence tears herself into two parts, as she describes, but then it was like getting stuck on the train and almost being cut down the middle. I realized with a brutal shock, and real place am I in? I wanted to tear myself free from that past. It had sucked me back in a vortex I could no longer support. To represent the condition of her fragmented self and multiple identities, Alexander uses quite apt imagery. She has taken the image of barbed wire from the post-colonial writer Frank Fanon, which she found during her childhood days in Tiruvalla Garden, because she spent her childhood days in Tiruvalla, Kerala. These times, this image suggests a border, boundary, or barrier between two regions. These barbed wires are always very difficult to cross, and the space in between them is no man's land. The author positions herself in a world which is segmented with barbed wire. In her words, the shelter, unhousedness, the multiple species that surround us, broken walls, prison cells, the thoughts turned jagged me. uh, Everything is overcrowded, everything is emptied out. I dream of barbed wire. Actually, she is a very well-known poet, so her writing is quite poetic. Emerged in a hybrid cultural space, the author compares her situation with the dried poppy seeds, which are blown about and dispersed in different places. Her condition is like the poppy seeds, which are separated from their original place. To quote her, as if seeds were blown out of a dried poppy pod and shook roughly, dispersed, flying, or as if the inside of a silk cotton pod had broken and the tiny dark life within had blown out, removed itself, and fallen a great distance from the upswept branches of the tree. Alexander questions her status in such a blown out state. Being an inhabitant of a segmented world, she considers herself as a disconnected and discontinuous whole. She thinks as if she has been thrown out. She compares herself with a waste basket, where she tries to piece together an identity. In her language, to quote her, but in my mind's eye, I kept seeing that basket burning, filled with waste paper from writing that never had time or space to come to anything, torn pages of Sears catalog, fourth-rate junk mail, bits of soiled tissue paper. Where was the life I had led? Who was I? Alexander tries to survive in such a tormented state. She feels suffocated with such a condition which restricts her freedom of living. She identifies herself with the bird in a cage who cannot live freely in this world, whose independence is prohibited. She compares her condition with the parrot of Banabhatta's Kadambari, who is encaged and subjected to interrogation. Tell me everything about, to quote her, tell me everything about yourself, starting with your birth, where were you born, who gave you your name, who is your mother, who is your father, do you remember what happened to you in another life, how were you caught in this cage? Alexander is always in a dilemma to find out a proper place to designate as her homeland. For her, home is more of a concept of psychological than of physical. While her biological self dwells in different places, her actual self, her soul is very much rooted in India. She considers house as a burden. She asks several questions to herself. I ask myself, am I a creature with no home, no nation? And if so, what new genus could I possibly be? She finds fault, cracks, or fissures on the ground where her house stands on. My house is split through a fault in the ground where it stands. They are auctioning my soul. They are as if they are auctioning fish, catfish, swordfish scooped from the Arabian Sea, 10,000 miles from Poe's cottage. So then Alexander shares the experience of her racial and ethnic status in America. She finds herself a minority in terms of culture, race, location, and identity in a foreign country. In her view, this status cannot be shared or withdrawn till her death. Through saying in America, though staying in America is exciting, but it is up to a point, and after these, everything ends. In her words, I can make myself up, and this is the enticement, the exhilaration, the compulsive energy of America, but only up to a point. And the sticking point, is my dark female body. I may try the voice-over bit, the words-over bit, the textual pyrotechnic bit, but my body is here now and cannot be shed. No more than any other human being can shed her or his body and still live. Alexander presents herself as an Indian, positions herself in India, and measures all distances from India. Her Indian identity is purely integral to her. So India is her here and America is her there. To a friend in America, she confides that she has the feel at homeness with India only. In India, I rest, I just am like a stone, a bone, a child born again. Though the author has led a nomadic life, she claims herself to be a native of Kerala. She considers her maternal grandfather's house in Tiruvalla as her home. She carries within her the permanent imprint of childhood days in the Tiruvalla house only, where she enjoyed her life without any fear. She cherished the actual sense of freedom there. She grew like a free bird in the lap of nature. In the beautiful landscape of village, she discovers actual bliss. She experiences the worth of being born human in that village. With those wonderful experiences of her childhood, she is made a complete individual. This is how she valorizes the remembered life in Tiruvalla. To quote her, in Tiruvalla, I could run as fast as I wanted, eyes closed, heart thudding, and no one would stop me. I felt I had no need of parents. I raced around crying, Athe, that if that I was Tattvam Asi. It says in the Upanishads, and in my childhood, I realized its truth. Tiruvalla house is her possible paradise, a special expression of her longing for rootedness. She finds the meaning of life in Tiruvalla house. She loses herself in that place, and and she becomes one with that place. It is the place where she discovers ultimate happiness and freedom. Alexander singles out Tiruvalla house for making her as an individual. All those experiences gathered in that place in her childhood contributes to the growing of the poet's mind. She ultimately admits that her childhood days have made her a complete human being, and through those memories, she justifies her presence in this earth. To quote her, and because it was, I am whole and entire. I do not need to think in order to be. I was a child there, and here I am. And though I cannot find the river that brought me here, yet I am because that I was. And this stubborn, shining thing persisted for me. It has done so for so many years. Thus, in her life narratives, Alexander presents herself as a historical nomad, facing the crisis of identity and the confusion of cultures. She explores the questions of identity, diaspora, ethnicity, language, femaleness, and racial discriminatory practices of the post-colonial world. She tackles these questions with utmost rationality. After several positionings, finally she throws light on her Indian home situated in Kerala as her abode of bliss, albeit as a possibility. So that's all which I have.
Thank you very much, Ashapurna.
So it's my pleasure to speak something in front of you, sir.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So, are we at the end of the session of presentation?
Yes, sir.
All right. Are there some people in the audience, or the presenters are pretty much the audience
No,
here?
sir. There are audiences.
There are. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So we have the very interesting paper 4 by Saurav, Sakshi, Diptak, and Ashapurna. Okay, Saurabh was talking about Caribbean diasporic identities, and he was talking about the anxiety of not just the colonized but also the colonizers, and agentiality as a factor of any diasporic person as to how to have agentiality as a diasporic identity in a place which always makes one very conscious of his or her being an outsider. So that's a very important question. Maybe some of the people in the audience would like to address that particular issue of agentiality or agency and the whole process of assimilation. To what extent it is possible? Perhaps these are a couple of questions that might arise from this paper. And Sakshi was talking about multiple identities, the in between space. And what is very interesting about that novel is actually how is the diasporic experience of a second or third generation diaspora, and how it's different from the first generation diaspora. There always is a tension, as you know, between the first generation diaspora and, um, for instance, Gogol and his parents. Um, there has to be a difference. Gogol has other problems, not the problems the same as his parents have already had. Okay, and Dipta Kule's half-inch Himalayas is very sketchy though, because he has uh, not done any analysis of any particular poem there. But then I believe learning Urdu could have been a wonderful poem, although it is not there in that particular anthology, or The Town Without a Post Office or something. These are some of the very interesting poems that we talked about, where, he's talking about partition. In fact, partition not merely in Pakistan and India, but also partitions that have come about within Kashmir, which actually has a very vibrant Catholic and very tolerant culture, where Hindus and Muslims have lived together with great amity and um, you know communal harmony. In fact, is the distinctive feature of Kashmiriyat or Kashmiri culture, and Sufi tradition itself actually is a very important factor to, you know, to promote this ethos of tolerance and love. So that is what it is, and maybe some people would like to respond to that. And Asha Purna talked about the fragmented identities and the Tiruvala house of uh, this particular novelist, Mina Alexander. Okay. And the search for home, as you know, becomes a constant trope in all these diasporic writings. So let's take up some questions. If you have questions, please uh, direct them to the speakers, and we'll see what emerges from the interactive session. Yeah. Any questions from the audience? No questions? Is there somebody to coordinate the whole thing? Yeah, Cynthia. Do you have a question, Cynthia? dear chair, my Roshni, oh, well, to everyone. There is one Roshni, and have we missed out some Roshni?
Yeah.
Who was to make some presentation?
Yes, no, yes, no,
Who is coordinating the whole thing? Please, I'm getting totally distraught here. Who is there to help me in this webinar?
Sir, till the time anyone steps in, can we have your viewpoint on certain questions that we might be studying right now? So you can enlighten us further about those questions or doubts.
Okay. As far as my understanding of diasporic literature goes, it's all about the search for identity. And although search for identity, as you know, is very a fundamental existential theme that we find not merely in diasporic literature, but also in the non-diasporic general literature. In a way, perhaps we are searching for the life of our existence, and that is connected with our identity. And when we talk about identity, we always do talk about our identity only in relation to a certain space. A space and the nature of that space, whether it's a filiative space or a non-filiative space, whether it's a space very close to our heart or it is an alien space. Yeah, is there, but I have to interrupt now. Actually, it's all good getting haywire. There is one Dr. Roshni who wants to make her presentation. Yeah, so I don't know whether Dr. Roshni's name featured. I don't remember. Are there but since she wants to make a presentation, she's welcome. Please, Dr. Roshni, if you have to.
As per the schedule that was shared with us, there were 6 presenters and her name was not there in the list.
No, but who is coordinating now? I can't be left alone here. Like, I mean, there is someone who ought to actually, any webmaster or organizer. Are they there? But let's listen to Roshni. Maybe she can address some of the issues.
No, sir, Tanmoy here, sir.
Yeah, Tanmoy, what is
so we have another session from 5:15. So we have to end the session. So no one is there in this list. So I request Rector.
Let me tell you something. Actually, the whole thing seems to be very seamless. Do you understand? Because I was watching quite a bit of the proceeding of the earlier session. This is not how things are done. You know, why would I feel that I'm intruding into some other session? You ought to have clear boundaries.
No, sir, but sir, in webinar we can't expect that the schedule will go according to time.
Why do you crowd all these things? This become very embarrassing for us. No, the thing is that this lady, as I understand, is for the other session. Okay, she wants. Is that so? Is that so?
Victor, please carry on. So give vote of thanks to sir and the speakers.
Yes, I think we have arrived at the end of the session. That was a dynamic one. Thanks to all the paper presenters and the chairperson for cooperating and making this a success. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is there anybody?
Yeah. Hello, ma'am. Hello. Am I audible, ma'am?
What is going on? We wanted to hear Mr. Ashok Mohapatra.
No, I think the session has been ended. We are shifting to the next session. I mean, the parallel session that you were in, that's ended. So thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We're moving ahead to the second one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tanmoy sir, should we go with the next session? Or
To carry on, I am bringing them to the screen. You just carry on.
Yeah, sure. I think, yeah, ma'am is also here. So hello everyone again, and welcome to this session. this e-conference organized by New Literaria Journal in active collaboration with Assam University Department of English. And welcome to this session of presentation. We have 6 very interesting presentation, and for that we have our distinguished chairperson, Professor Pinky Isha, Assistant Professor of English, Rabindra Bharati University. So welcome you, ma'am, first of all. Let me just have this opportunity to share some of his achievements and a very brief bio of her. So Professor Pinky is an assistant professor in Rabindra Bharati University, West Bengal. Her areas of interest lies in Caribbean and Australian literature, 20th century British drama, and folkloric studies. She has authored and co-authored several national and international publications, and also working as a reviewer for reputed professional journals across the globe. So with that very short intro, I welcome you, ma'am, to this session and to take over this forward. And we have 6 presenters here. I would just request all the presenters to keep their video open while they are presenting. So that's it from my side, ma'am. So it's over to you now.
Thank you, Tanmay, for that introduction. I was just looking into the other session that went before this, and I think there's this lady, Dr. Roshni, who's left out. Can we accommodate her in this session? Because I feel bad not to have her, because she was constantly saying that she was there as a presenter, but that depends on the person, I mean the organizers as well. Before we start, I welcome all the paper presenters.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you. Actually, what has happened, if they don't enter with their own name, so I can't identify who is the speaker, who is the presenter here. So they are entering the session with others' names. So I'm trying to find out, trying to identify whether they are in the room or not.
Yeah, then I think we can accommodate her for 5 to 6 minutes.
Yes, we can accommodate.
I welcome all the paper presenters. Shatarupa Mishra, I have a few names here. Richa Chilana, Jane Mary Joseph, and RC Lalthi Mani, and Mrs. Pasha Burman, Samreen Fatima, Neha Tiwari. I heartily welcome all of you to this session, and we would like to begin. Yes, do we have the first paper presenter? Mrs. Shatarupa Mishra? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are. I think she is here already.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Actually, I must mention something. My name was actually repeated. I joined the previous session and I already presented my paper in that session. And I find that my name is here again. So I joined. So what should I do? Should I present it?
No. I think if you've presented it once, I don't think there's any necessity of presenting it again.
Yeah, I think confusion. Yeah, better to give chance to others, those who, I mean, those who have not got a spot, because I've already presented. So I was in confusion. That is why I joined, because I was the first speaker. So at least I must inform. So I joined.
So we can go on to the next speaker. Mrs. Richa Chilana.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're both audible and visible.
Can I share my screen? Because I have a PPT. I'll work through the PPT.
Yeah, you can.
So my paper is titled Bodies in the Haveli, Parveen Mysteries Adventures in Colonial Bombay. I'm looking at Sujata Massey's Parveen mystery novels, which is an example of detective fiction, specifically an example of clue puzzle mysteries. And I'm trying to look at how the Parveen mystery novels are actually a post-colonial critique of Cornelia Sorabji's work, her memoirs, as well as her fictional narratives, that is Love and Life Behind the Parda. So I want to begin by focusing on the things that Edward Said talks about in Orientalism. By talking about Orientalist discourse, he focuses on the exteriority of the Orientalist, that the Orientalist is usually above um, the Orient in the sense that he places himself in a position of exteriority. He acquires a vantage point, and from that vantage point, he looks at the Orient. There's never any sense of involvement, there's always a detachment. And this is what Edward Said says in Orientalism: the Orient is watched since its almost offensive behavioral behavior issues out of a reservoir of infinite peculiarity. The European whose sensibility towards the Orient is a watcher, never involved, always detached. The Orient then becomes a living tableau of queerness. So, in Orientalism, which was published in 1978, a seminal work of postcolonial theory, he talks about the Orientalist as a watcher who's always outside the Orient. And there's an assumption that the Orient lacks the epistemological apparatus to understand itself and also to articulate itself for others. The two themes that dominate in Orientalist discourse are lasciviousness and innate violence of the Orient, according to Rana Kabani. And there's also an exoticization and feminization of the Orient that happens hand in hand. The Orient is imagined as an Oriental woman. Edward Lane talks about how he imagines himself as a bridegroom, and when he's approaching the Orient, he's like a bridegroom who's about to unveil his bride. So, this painting by Delacroix indicates the exoticization and feminization of the Orient. I want to focus on Cornelia Sorabji's writings, who was the first woman barrister and a Zanana official to be appointed to the Court of Wards in Bengal, because a lot of women were secluded. There was a need for women like Cornelia Sorabji who could enter the Zanana, who could enter the women's space and deal with issues of inheritance, succession, etc. And these were the cases which actually came to her. So I'm specifically looking at her memoirs, India Calling, and also her short stories, Love and Life Behind the Parda, in which she focuses on Parda-clad women. But if you look at Cornelia Sorabji's writings, and this is something that she also says in the introduction, she wrote because there was a market that was created at that time for writings about Parda-clad women, and she was catering to that market. She was catering primarily to the curiosity of her British friends and acquaintances, like a typical Orientalist. And this is what Sorabji says in her writings about the Zanana. What do the ladies do all day, you ask? Quarrel? No, they are too lethargic for any such activity. Most of them turn over and fondle their lovely jewels and silk garments. One Rani has taken a violent passion for the harmonium. She has dozens of them in all sizes and by all makers, but refuses to be taught how to handle the instrument in the conventional way. As she is energetic about playing, you can imagine the consequence. I no longer wonder that half a mile divides the king's apartment from the Zanana. So, as we can see, that Sorabji's narrator is always outside the Zanana, even when she's inside the Zanana. There's no attempt to empathize with the Parda Nashin, with the Parda clad women, nor is there an attempt to understand their daily negotiations or their attempt to subvert or defy the dominant script. Um, when she talks about her cases, she says that these were cases which were in an itinerary and setting which were like an adaptation of the Arabian Nights. She makes sweeping generalizations while talking about the Pardanashi. For the Hindu, there was the outside where the men lived, and the inside for the women. So this reminds me of Chandra Talpade Mohanty's critique of Western discourse, in which he talks about how Western feminists tend to look at the third world woman as a singular, monolithic, homogeneous category. So the heterogeneity and the diversity of the third world woman, and also her agency, is something which is completely ignored by Orientalist discourse. She also uses a spatial imagery of enclosure to talk about women in the Zanana. When she talks about the walls of the Zanana, she constantly compares it with prison walls. And the category of the Indian Parda Nashin, a homogeneous category, is something that you find in Cornelia Sorabji's writings. There's absolutely no attempt to understand the diverse nature of this category. And also their daily negotiations and engagements with the forces that govern their lives. And like I said, that there's an exteriority on the part of Sorabji as well as her narrators. The two novels that I want to focus on, Sujata Massey's Perveen mystery novels, The Satapur Moonstone and A Murder on Malabar Hill. The Satapur Moonstone was published in 2019. Murder on Malabar Hill was her first Perveen mystery novel, which was published in 2018. And both these novels are set in 1920s Mumbai. And these are examples of detective fiction. Perveen Mystery is a Parsi woman. The Murder on Malabar Hill, it actually moves back and forth. The narrative looks at Perveen Mystery's own traumatic personal past, her marriage to Cyrus Sodawala, um, the adultery of her husband, and also the fact that he gave her a sexually transmitted disease. And then it moves forward in time and looks at 1920s, where she has to solve the mystery of Farid's death, who actually worked as a agent, ruling agent, governing agent for Omar Farid. So both the novels deal with issues of succession and inheritance. And because women who were inside the Zanana did not want to break the code of the Zanana, Parveen Mistry being a woman, she enters the Zanana and she engages with these women and she interacts with these women. So we are told that Parveen Mistry was a member of the Indian National Congress. She was a young woman rising in Bombay's legal scene. She was a daughter of Jamshedji Mistry and an ardent supporter of Gandhi. When we look at Cornelia Sorabji's life, we are told time and again, and this is something that again she talks about in her memoirs, that she was against women's franchise. She was an ardent supporter of the British rule. And as against that, we are told about Perveen Mistry being a complete rebel. She was an advocate of self-rule. And every now and then, Sujata Massey tells us about Perveen Mistry's stand on the British rule. Now, everything is filtered through the consciousness of Perveen Mistry. She's the narrative and ideological center of the novels. There's an explicit critique of British colonialism that we find in the novels. And there's a refusal to reduce the Indian woman to a singular monolithic category of victimhood, that even when she talks about the Barda clad woman, she talks about, for example, in this particular case, the focus on Choti Rani or Mirabai, she talks about how she challenges conventional notions of femininity. And Choti Rani, Mirabai, although she's a Parda clad woman, but she's not the archetypal victim. She's agential, she's resourceful, and she does push boundaries in her own ways. She also refers to the Maharani of Cooch Behar, who had shed the veil. So while talking about the parda, and by parda I mean the garment which veils women, and also the ideological division of space on the basis of gender into Mardana and Zanana, Parveen Mistry does not make sweeping generalizations about the parda nasheen. She says, of course, she thought Sir David was better than most English administrators, and he had certainly been respectful of her own professional commitments. But he seemed to share the common belief that the vast majority of Indian women were faceless, nameless, and passive. So this is how Parveen Mistry, who is the ideological center of the novel, she comments on British colonialism, and she also comments on the use of feminist rhetoric by colonizers to defend colonization. The whole argument about white men saving brown women from brown men, which Spivak also talks about in Can the Subaltern Speak? We are told that Parveen is a victim of Parsi marriage law, that according to Parsi marriage law, Parveen could not divorce her husband. Although her husband is violent, he's extremely aggressive. He also cheats on her, but she's not allowed to divorce him because Parsi marriage law at that time recognized adultery with someone who was not a prostitute. And this is a conversation that she has with another character in Satapur Moonstone, which also indicates how she offers a critique of the personal marriage laws of the 20th century and how the British upheld these personal laws to appease the so-called natives. I can't believe marriage is so restrictive for such a progressive religion, he said, frowning, because it is assumed that the Parsi community is more progressive as compared to the other communities. And by focusing on Parveen Mistry's predicament and her miserable plight, Sujata Massey talks about the condition of women in general in the 20th century. The British approved the standing laws made by Parsi males, she pointed out. Your government also upholds unfair family laws in other religious communities, rules that keep daughters from inheriting as much as sons, widows from owning property, and men and women from leaving unhappy marriages. This is actually my concluding slide, and these are some of the questions that I was trying to answer. That is there an Indian Pardanashi? Sujata Massey, through Parveen Mistry, she rejects the idea of a category called Indian Pardanashi because she talks about the diverse, heterogeneous way in which women who wear the veil behave. And there are also attempts by Sujata Massey to indicate the similarities between Parveen Mistry, a Parsi woman, and these Pardanashi, women who wear the veil, because there was a culture of modesty in the early 20th century, which was a culture which was common to uh, women in general in India, not specifically to women who were in the Zanana. We are told that Parveen is an advocate of self-rule, and there's an explicit critique of British colonialism and British rule in both the novels. There's an attempt to forge a sisterhood on the basis of gender. For example, there's a long section in The Murder on Malabar Hill where we are told about this Parsi custom called Bina Mazi, which means being without prayer, which is the custom of feminine seclusion, in which women who were menstruating, Parsi women who were menstruating, were supposed to confine themselves to a small room, not interact with the rest of the family, and not step out of that room because it was assumed that a menstruating woman is polluted and polluting. So Parveen indicates how this custom of feminine seclusion, which was followed by a progressive community like the Parsis, and the custom of the Zanana are not very different in terms of the ideological bent, in terms of this attempt to seclude women or to confine them to a small space, to a limited space. So there's an attempt to see the similarities between the protagonist, Parveen Mistry, and the Pardanashi, an attempt which was not there in Cornelia Sorabji's writings because the narrator is always exterior to what she's describing. There's a very scathing indictment of the plight of women in both the novels, Malabar Hill and Satapur Moonstone. So it's not just a post-colonial critique of Cornelia Sorabji's writings, it's also a feminist critique of the predicament of women in the early 20th century. And another point that I want to make is Massey's reworking of the clue puzzle mystery. The clue puzzle mystery which flourished, the British clue puzzle mystery which flourished in between the two world wars in the golden age of detective fiction, so to say. It had a particular kind of a structure in which the detective was the cerebral, rational individual who was supposed to collect all the clues together and complete the puzzle. But these mysteries, if you look at Agatha Christie's mysteries particularly, they were extremely problem oriented, that there was a certain problem which was presented before the readers and the detective, and they were supposed to solve that problem. There was no investment in characterization, in the predicament of women, which is something that Sujata Massey works on. That there's a lot of focus on the condition of Parveen Mistry in particular, and also the condition of the women who were confined to the four walls of the house through the parda. So she reworks the clue puzzle mystery by through a very elaborate kind of a delineation of her characters, and also the way in which she talks about the personal traumatic past of her detective, something which Agatha Christie and other uh, writers who were associated with the golden age of detective fiction never did. The detective is usually this, asexual, rational, cerebral figure, which is something that we do not see in Sujata Massey's fiction. So it's a post-colonial critique of Cornelia Sorabji's writing, the feminist critique of the predicament of women in the 20th century, and it's also a drastic reworking of the clue puzzle mystery. Thank you.
Richa. Before the questions, which I would do at the end, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
We would take the questions later on, and I would comment on the papers later on. But as of now, it was a good paper. Thank you, Mrs. Richa Chilana. We go on to the next paper presenter, do we?
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay. So shall I start then?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jane Mary Joseph, and I'm a research scholar in the Department of English, Mizoram University. And the paper that I'm going to present today is a co-authored one, and my co-author is Professor K.C. Lalfawani, also currently the head in the Department of English in the same university. Our paper is titled A Macabre Decay of the Human Body, a Study of Select Black Death Paintings. The horror of the human experience during the Black Death was captured by artists in their paintings. As opposed to the art that existed for centuries before the plague, the Black Death paintings presented grotesque images of the human body, which became the primary site of suffering. From the dark motives of people helplessly witnessing their bodies decay to skeletons ruling over the living, artists offered a macabre eye to view the lived experiences of the pandemic through art. The grotesque is evident not only in the effects of the plague on the physical body, but also on the human mind. Many abandoned their families who were infected by the disease for fear of contracting it. The apocalyptic approach adopted in these works posits a marked departure in the perception of religion from the times before the plague hit Europe. The pandemic, which appeared to be the devil's slaughter, led to a general disillusionment with religion. The beliefs that Christianity formed the center of human existence and that it triumphed over death were overturned with the advent of the plague. The artists brought to life these grim signs around them. The gradual decaying of the bodies of one's neighbors, the streets filled with corpses, and the victory death had over life occupied the canvases, thus providing evidence for posterity on how the pandemic caused decay of the human body and through it, the breaking down of established orders and belief systems. In his The Decameron, 1353, Giovanni Boccaccio writes, in men and women alike, it was betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groins or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two set parts of the body, this deadly gabatulo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change. Black spots or livid, making their appearance in many cases on the arm or on the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous. The psychological implications of the pandemic were manifold, and together with the physical body, the human mind died a slow death when man placed his own self before even those closest to him. Father, abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another. The first painting, Triumph of Death, 1350 by Francesco Treni, is a narrative painting comprising 7 scenes, all of which depict the Black Death. The painting brings forth a clear distinction between the spiritual world, which forms the upper part of the fresco, and the upper part of the fresco, and the physical world, which forms the lower part. Though there appears to be no narrative connection between the scenes, the inevitability of death that grips the beholder is the overarching theme in each one of them. For all its embedded narrative, it does not claim unity of action or unity of space, but offers a conceptual arrangement that organizes the many narrative units. The single episode is as real as the overall structure is abstract. The subject can be described as the power of death to dash all earthly hope. The first scene of the painting derives from a French legend where 3 young noblemen who are out hunting discover 3 corpses in their coffins in different stages of decomposition. The first body wears an elegant hat and footwear, the second has a crown on his head while his body is bloated, and the third is a skeleton that faces the beholder. The olfactory images add to the grotesquerie when the sight and smell in front of them greatly disgust the 3 noblemen. The presence of corpses accounts for the rising interest that most artists had during that period with the subjects of death and decay. Treni's painting also serves as a reminder for the living: what we were, you are; what we are, you will be. The second scene shows beggars in the physical world who are a rich group of lepers, cripples, and beggars. One with his nose eaten away, others legless or blind, or holding out a cloth-covered stump instead of a hat, imploring death for deliverance. The deformed appearances of the beggars add to the dark nature of the painting. Their physical bodies have given up on them, and the only solace they have is in the hope of death, a stark contrast to earlier periods when works of art explored the joys of life. The macabre decay of the human body is further stressed in the third scene, which is filled with corpses, again a fitting example of the physical world. In a heap of corpses nearby lie crowned rulers, a poet in tiaras, a knight crumbled together with the bodies of the poor. Training here draws on the ultimate truth that death is a leveler who does not discriminate on any grounds. Trainee's personification of death in the fresco is seen in the fourth scene. He neither uses the early to mid 14th century symbol of a corpse holding a weapon of death, nor the image of the Grim Reaper in a black cloth with a scythe in hand. The representation of death here is as a black-cloaked old woman with streaming hair and wild eyes carrying a broad-bladed murderous scythe. The grotesque nature of Trainee's symbol of death lies in its duality of being both human and beast, an old woman with dark wings on her back with clawed feet holding the scythe. Such a representation not only evokes fear in the beholder, but leads him to realize the duality of his own personality. The hybrid combination of human and animal lies at the heart of the figurative vocabulary through which Jane Alexander's sculptural tableau summon us into the imaginative domain of the humanimal, a domain where the boundaries by which religion, philosophy, and science have separated man, God, and beast are torn apart, and where the rules and conventions that ordinarily seek to impose order over our world take a tumble. The fifth scene shows a group of 7 young ladies and 3 noblemen who are carefree. They are blissfully unaware of the impending darkness in the form of death hovering over them. Trainee uses this scene to comment on how, more often than not, the human mind is preoccupied with worldly pleasures that it fails to see the meaninglessness attached to them and how transient life really is. In the sixth scene, Trainee presents the beholder with a battle between the angels and the devils for the souls of those who died from the plague. The macabre death of the human soul together with the body is seen when the devils take some souls represented as naked small figures from the mouth of the death and carry them to the burning mountain to be thrown into hell, while others are saved by the angels. The last scene in the painting portrays a peaceful existence of men in the spiritual world that is far removed from the chaotic life of the physical world. What should be noted here is that while they perform their daily chores, the anchorites and hermits wait for death. It differs from the previous scenes in that it views death in the light of acceptance and not of fear. The second painting, Dance of Death, by Bernd Notke, which was painted in between 1463 to 1466, is one of the most famous works of the late medieval Dance of Death paintings. It shows a preacher who stands in a pulpit and warns man about the inevitability of death. Next to him is seated a skeleton dressed in linen playing his bagpipes, who appears to stare at the beholder. It is believed that these bagpipes were used to awaken the dead. To the right of this figure is yet another skeleton draped in linen. On his right shoulder he carries a coffin, while with his left hand he pulls the Pope into the dance macabre. The frowning Pope with his papal tiara and crosier is led by the skeleton to dance, where eerie visuals of skeletons dancing in grotesque manners form part of the fresco. As Elena Gertzman says, a grinning skeleton follows, and after him comes the Holy Roman Emperor with orb and sword. Death, covered in a torn shroud, grabs his shoulder as well as the elbow of the Empress, who raises her left arm towards the sky in an exaggerated gesture of sorrow. Then follows another skeleton who leads a cardinal dressed in red, his hand reaching to his heart. The panel continues with Death, who turns toward the king with scepter, followed in turn by the remaining skeleton. The procession is headed towards their graves and is complete with a duke, an abbot, a knight, a craftsman, a hermit, a peasant, a youth, a maiden, and a child in a cradle. It depicts how death is always coupled with the living. While it revolves around the universality of death, it also dwells on how no matter what one's station in life is, death would one day come to take everyone. Artists who lived during the pandemic were greatly influenced by it. Such works produced under the impact of the Black Death reminds one of how fleeting life is and how meaningless the glories of earthly life are. The paintings discussed here are direct symbols of the catastrophe of the plague and the sufferings of those who were its victims. They beautifully captured the gruesome reality of death. While the Black Death occurred centuries ago, it is of great significance today where we live our lives through a pandemic. The widespread and sudden outbreak left indelible marks on the hearts and minds of the medieval people. These works awaken us to the realization that regardless of the differences in time and space, the soul of man is essentially the same. So that's all for my presentation.
Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you are audible. You probably muted yourself again. I think. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes. Mrs. Jane Mary Joseph, you could have shown some of the paintings about Black Death, which you were actually speaking about, but we'll take this up towards the end. But otherwise, it was a good paper. We move on to the next speaker. Mrs. Porsho Borman, or is it Mrs. Parsha Burman? Do we have her?
Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes. Mr. Borman, you're audible.
Okay. So I'd like to share my screen.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Is my presentation visible?
Yes, it's visible. It's visible.
Okay. Thank you. The title of my paper is Overtaking the Empire, a Post-Colonial Surveillance of the Curious Subaltern Figure of the Mail Runner. The history of the postal services in India carries a unique legacy of being one of the earliest of the kind. Ancient practice of using doves as carriers of letters has found mention in several old Indian literature. The relatively later employment of foot runners into the postal system can be traced as far as the reigns of Chandragupta Maurya, who lived from 322 to 298 BC. The foot runners, also known as Harkada and Dauria, were men, I quote, who ran for their living, carrying public and private mail to distant places, end quote, as Chitra Joshi introduces in her study. The typical runner figure of a black man, a black of course in quotes, with a vest clad or bare top and a dhoti on the bottom, with a lantern and bells attached to the end of his spear, has been part of Indian postal history for a very long time. They were employed chiefly by the regional rulers and established communications across kingdoms. The postal system was supposedly established in the early days with a primary military aim of exchanging information about state defenses, internal political situation, and external threats from other monarchies. Slowly, with time, the system trickled down to the lower strata of the society, where the commoners took up to writing and sending letters via these mail runners. The runners, who have attained legendary status of Herculean ambit, soon got morphed into men of all work, as Mark R. Frost comments in his essay. The higher and upper middle class socialites would very often recruit them to run for their errand beside the usual males, which renders Mark Frost to name them with men of all work. These assiduous men hailed majorly from the section of the society whom we now identify as the Dalits or the oppressed. In his monograph, The Post Office of India, Geoffrey Clark identifies the runners as largely drawn from the less civilized races of India, many of whom are animists by religion. The comment quite naturally stings of the imperialist evaluation of indigenous populace. A point to be noted is Clark was the Postmaster General of the Northwest Frontier Province of the Imperial Post Office of India. Though comparatively less outrageous and discourteous than almost every other British account of the contemporary Indian situation, one cannot overlook the typical colonial and Eurocentric attitude in his book, that is considered one of the pillars of Indian post historiography. In this book, one also finds accounts about the runners that testify them as the chief medium of mail transportation in the early days of the imperial post. The Imperial Post Office of India was instituted in 1854 following the military rebellion of 1857 by the then Governor General Lord Dalhousie, realizing the possibility of future mass unrests in India. In an attempt to bridge the communication gulf between different parts of its Southeast Asian colony, the empire tried to unite, or we can call it acquire, the existing provincial private postal services owned mostly by affluent tradesmen into the imperial post. It came as a significant part of what Daniel Hedrick calls, and I quote, the modernization program that Dalhousie had instituted in India to make Britain's presence on the subcontinent profitable and permanent. End quote. Besides, it also came as a huge blow to the Indians who found in the provincial posts and zamindari daks an easy, affordable, cheap medium to contact their relatives and their acquaintances. This consolidation project even threatened the nationalist revolutionary groups that were growing in India. The two used the provincial daks to deliver anti-government and anti-company correspondence without the rulers getting any whim of it. The National Postal Service, just like the Indian Railways, was opened originally for the empowered class in colonial India, but soon It had to be opened up for the impoverished public, as the expense of these new services was, and I quote, far greater than even the British government could afford, end quote. British rule had made a huge blunder in unlocking these two huge infrastructures for the common public. The Indian Post and the Indian Railways were to become the biggest carriers of the Indian freedom movement, displacing sentiments and the mass across the empire. Once the consolidation program was over, the runners became Raj Mullazims, or government employees. The private darks still posed a threat to its British India's sovereignty as the company perceived, and so with the passing of about a decade, in the 1860s, the few remaining independent private darks were brutally crushed and plundered, and the runners were often tortured to death or chased away from the nativity. Under the piling crisis of this situation, the Daurias went underground and began relaying information between the sprawling pro-independence leaders and mass organizations in different corners of the country. They often provided voluntary service towards India's socio-political emancipation mission and were paid with free meals and basic amenities. However, the job of exchanging information against the colonial power invited inconceivable life risks and obstacles that the Harkaras were to overcome only with the aid of their unfathomable dedication and indomitable spirit. Clark observes that for them the mailbag was a kind of, quote, fetish, which must be protected and got to its destination at all costs, end quote. The story Dak Harkara by Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay and the poem Runner by Shukanto Bhattacharya both speak of the same awe-inspiring commitment and devotion that these overlooked heroes of Indian history figured. In the story Dak Harkara, we see Dinu, an aged runner, as the protagonist. It is a tale of his faithfulness, and Dinu is the most apt representative of his occupational community, as far as the story goes. The main plot of the story narrates how he gets into a violent physical encounter with a bandit who was actually his son Nitai, while traversing his usual path and gets severely wounded. Yet he struggles and succeeds in protecting his mailbag, and later the posts are delivered safely. Similar echoes of devoutness are heard in Bhattacharya's poem, but the poet presents him as an exotic figure, almost like a superhero of Occidental myths who could subvert all hurdles to accomplish his job. The poem extols the unquestionable commitment and honesty that the Harkaras, or the male runners, exemplified, and the narrative hops from one instance to another of their daily routines. The Indian postal historiography even records with vivid descriptions the heroic encounters of runners with wild beasts, and tigers especially. Stories like such have crystallized into a kind of mythic folklore that adds to the valorizing project every day. Runners have been viewed in the post-colonial literature as a versatile figure who perfectly materializes the patriarchal notion of a, I quote, man being a man. However, this panegyric treatment has only cornered the Daurias in literature existentially, to such extent that we don't really find instances where they come up as the spokesperson and narrating their own lives. In a nutshell, they exist only as long as we sympathize or we valorize them. All the literary pieces like Dak Harkara or Rudyard Kipling's The Overland Mail attempt to capture fringes of the runners' lives, it essentially falls prey to the Orientalist narrative of folk fiction that the colonial rule created and around these pre-colonial postmen. The colonial rule's psychosocial Orientalism has its limitations that follow upon disregarding, essentializing, denuding the humanity of another culture, people, or geographical region, as Said notes in his seminal work Orientalism. In literature, we may rarely find stories about them, but never their stories. The runner's voice remains always overshadowed by the geologized and sympathizing narrative of the stories, making them a classic subaltern figure. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear? Yes, thank you, Dr. Borman. That was a very interesting paper. I'll talk about this later. But as of now, I was seeing that people are asking for feedback links. Tonmai, can you help us with that? Because some people are eager to post their feedback. So please help with.
We will share that in due time.
Yes,
Tomorrow,
yes.
tomorrow after the end of this webinar, we will share to them.
Because I think they were eager and there were many people coming up with that. Thank you, Mr. Bormon. We go on to the next speaker. It is Samreen Fatima. Samreen Fatima, are you there? Yes, Samreen Fatima.
I can't find her. I don't know by if she has joined. So in that case, she can raise her hand so that I can identify easily. It would be very convenient.
Yes, if she's there, then.
So we can move to the next presenter in the meantime.
Move to Ms. Neha Tiwari, who will be presenting a paper on reading Satyajit Ray's Aguntuk from post-colonial perspective. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Am I visible?
Yeah, you are visible and audible both.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I will be reading Satyajit Ray's Aguntuk from Postcolonial Optics, as you have mentioned. Hybridity is the key concept that has emerged from post-colonial concerns, and the colonization has brought cultural hybridity in colonial spaces. Consequently, most of the post-colonial study revolves around the search of identity and desire to retrieve it. Simultaneously, struggling for essentialism and authentication also exists. And the colonizers have always certain optics to look upon colonized culture. Almost all colonized cultures have experienced the same, and the essentialism triggered by national movement initially leads to search for the identity, but soon the realization comes that the retrieving is not possible as authentication of what is retrieved itself being questioned. This understanding leads to acceptance and the negotiation between the colonizer and colonized. And most writers, focus on the fact that the political subject of decolonization is itself a new entry and endangered by the encounter between two conflict systems of belief. And anti-colonial identities, as Stuart Hall argues, do not owe their origins to a pure and stable essence. And similarly, this argument has been given by Bhava as well, that we have the hybridity there. If once the person is colonized and we are trying to look for the certain kind of the cross communication hybridity. So such post-colonial concepts have been beautifully presented in the film Agantuk, which has been directed by the internationally acclaimed film director Satyajit Ray. And Agantuk, which came in 1991, and it was in Bangla, of course, the tussle of East and West and science and religion, faith and betrayal, and then right and wrong, happiness and money, mainstream and marginalized, nature and machine. These are the issues which have been raised in this cinema, and not just the issues have been raised by the Satyajit Ray, but it has been well argued as well. And in the masterly hand of Satyajit Ray, Agantuk becomes a candid documentation of ideological anxiety experienced by Satyajit Ray himself and contemporary India, based on the beautiful short story Athithi. Agantuk explores the multidimensional inquiry about development and progress, innocence and purity of must, which must be recognized and saved as it leads to peace and prosperity of the human being. Now, doubting everything may lead to chaos and confusion. That is what the Agantuk seems to suggest. And I'm trying to argue in this film that the people who are the modern society or the modern audience who are seeking different kind of answers for this modern chaos, this cinema seems to give answers Like in Mahabharata, we find that Arjun has different questions, and Lord Krishna, he is answering the all questions related with identity and the presence and the existential questions. So, in a similar manner, Satyajit Ray has argued in this cinema, and that makes it very different from the other cinema. Now, it is very interesting to see that the Satyajit Ray's cinema Aparajito, which came in 1956, which is a part of trilogy, we all know that. So in that, we find that Appu has a different kind of curiosity for science, and he leaves his parents, mother alone, just for higher studies. And when he's going by train, which itself is a symbol in many of the films of the Satyajit Ray. It's a symbol of modernity. It's a symbol of newness. And we see that he is going on train, but in his hand, we can find that there is a globe which reveals, which tells us that he is very much into science and modern education he's looking for. And he leaves his village and goes to Kolkata to study. But after 35 years, almost, this was the film in 1956, and now this is 1991 when Satyajit Ray is making Agantuk. And here we find that that this all notion of the negotiation which has come from the past culture, rural culture and modern culture has become entirely different. Here, the protagonist, Mr. Manmohan Mitra, is the anthropologist, and he has left his native land for foreign country, and he has been there for quite a while, almost 15 years he has spent there, and now he believes that he should come back to his own place. So he is returning from foreign land to native land, and in Aparajito there is a difference. The boy is leaving its native place, rural area, home, and going towards the unknown. So that realization which comes where within the premise of this understanding that from outside what the outer world looks is not the same. And when he reaches there in America, he finds that there are people who are actually the native people over there. And they are basically the owner of the land. And then the entire glamour, the entire magic of the Western idea, shatters, and he comes back. And now then he has in Kolkata, he wants to mix with the indigenous people, and he is visiting the representation that because he has returned to niece, and the husband of the niece is very skeptical, and all the time he is in argument about the identity of the Manmohan Mitra, and that makes a very interesting presentation, because he represents us, and we have a question. The modern man has a question for everything, and that seems to be argued there by the Satyajit Ray, because there is a person, lawyer friend is there, and all the time you will find in the movie that there is an argument between what is right and what is wrong, whether we should accept science or not, whether we should negotiate with the modern and the primitive culture, and what should be the negotiation point. And then, of course, they also talk about what is important. The man of the house where he has taken he has come as the guest or as the uncle. He is very much away from, now detached from money, but the entire family seems very much interested that how he is going to do with the money which he was supposed to inherit it. And later on in the end, we find that all the money, all the materialistic, treasure he leaves for the needs only. So it shows that there is a kind of cycle, a kind of journey of Satyajit Ray, which indirectly represents the journey of the post-colonial man as well, or the modern man as well. That in the Aparajito we find that there is a hope, there is a positivity towards the modern life. But maybe in 35 years, Satyajit Ray has experienced something different. And we also need to understand that Satyajit Ray himself was the product of kind of hybrid culture, because he was conscious about his Bengali identity. At the same time, he was having this European education, British education, and job-related work. For the job-related work, he has visited the America as well, and at the same time, he was very much into Indian culture. So these three forces were working on him, and he himself portrays that that tussle which goes with different kind of culture, and then ultimately one reaches to a certain kind of negotiation. So that way, I find that Agantuk is a very interesting study from the point of view of the Satyajit Ray's journey itself and the modern man's journey, where finally he reaches to certain kind of negotiation between the colonizers' culture and the people who are colonized. And all questions of authenticity or identification or essentialism, that yes, we are we belong to a particular place and we are like this, and that the specific culture is difficult to retrieve. And when this understanding comes, this hybridity or this acceptance for the present, the acceptance for the contemporary comes. So this is what I wanted to argue regarding this. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello? Yes, thank you, Mrs. Neha Tiwari. Now, do we have any more paper presenters in this session? Do
Yes,
we have
ma'am. We have Samreen Fatima ma'am here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You're audible and visible.
Second. I want to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yeah, it is visible. It is visible.
Good evening, respected chair, coordinators and participants. I, Samreen Fatima, research scholar at the Department of English, Aligarh Muslim University, will present my paper on the topic, A Critical Analysis of Narrative Identity and Narrative Othering in the Select Autographics. Autographics has been defined as a part of experimental literature, the eye of the comics. It is a form of graphic narrative which is written by a real person concerning one's own experiences, where the focus is one's life, in particular the story of one's identity. First, we can see that the form of autographic and identity formation is interconnected. In recapturing life's key events, in this storytelling format, one tries to come to the conclusion, who am I? And it is a fact that every individual do face these core questions of identity formation. Who am I? Where do I belong? What is expected from me? But these questions becomes extremely intricate when one is placed in a long-wrought conflict. The select autographics, where the authors are in a self-exploration journey, has Arab-Israeli conflict as a background. When identity, rather one of the identities, is one's political position, the demarcation between the self and the other is stamped and bitter. The other in question becomes a threat. However, we see that the self transforms into this other self. Instead of a clear-cut binary division between the self and the other enemy, the select authors transforms between the self, other, and other self.
The aim of my presentation is to showcase how the medium of storytelling and identity related, what is narrative identity, how autographic is an interesting platform to explore this intersectionality between self, other, and other self. So coming to our first question, what is narrative identity? In order to create, Monica Ludenac says, in order to create continuity between past and present, in order to lend meaning to the experiences that we have undergone, we construct a story of our life. Narrative identity, therefore, is a part of general performative identity, which we create inside our social roles. Identity, moreover, is reconstituted continuously in our self-narrations. How to Understand by Sarah Glidden is a journey to Jerusalem, visiting as a part of her birthright trip. She has to comply with her parents' and family tradition of knowing the historicity of the nation building concept of Israel. However, Sarah identifies herself as a Jew, US citizen, ideologically anti-Zionist, and pro-Palestinian. She traverses the place and comes across many other Hasidic Jews, Sephardic Jews, Israeli Jews, and so forth. One of her identities make her a part of this unified sense of self, and yet her political standpoints creates a barrier between them. Throughout this autographic, we see that Sarah is exploring herself, the other, and her other self. To define what is other self, Sami Schlorox defines other self as either an individual whom the self identifies with, or the one behave as other in order to fill or exploit the void that the identity have between the self and the other. So this concept, the concept of other self encourages one to think in relation to the self and the other, to show that there is a spectrum where both the other and the self can relate. So the other tries to create oneself as a concrete self. At the same time, the other is able to see in which position the other is standing. So when one sees other in this position, one is not seeing the other as an inferior. Instead, one tries to create a dialogical viewpoint between the two. Like Bakhtin says that you have to see the other in order to have a dialogue between yourself and the other. To draw a comparison between How to Understand Israel and Guy Delisle's Jerusalem Chronics from the Holy City, Guy, the narrator who has a neutral side, he is neither a Jew nor a Muslim, neither an Israeli nor a Palestinian, explores the idea of self and other. Guy Delisle goes there on travel. He spends a year living there with his wife. And so his viewpoint is important because he tries to be neutral. However, we see that he is not neutral. He showcases himself as being the better, the rational, and belonging to a civilized culture. He constantly questions the culture of both the Israeli and Palestinian citizens. So the Israeli and Palestinian citizen who were enemy to each other becomes one other in the eyes of Guy Delisle. Still, we see that even Guy Delisle comes across many instances where he cannot avoid being part of their culture. He reaches certain points where his universal perspective breaks down and he cannot visualize himself as a secular or a religious person. Like Judith Butler proposes that the concept of vulnerability to understand the way in which the self and other binary is not simple and clean, but rather that we are given over to the another and vulnerable to the touch and emotional effects of violence by or loss of the other. It is the vulnerability of the self and the other, the permeability of the boundaries that allows for the possibility of the other self. Thus, the paper seeks to go beyond binary thinking to explore what happens when one relates to the other, seeing oneself in another's image, or when one behaves differently than one would typically and causes the self to appear as other. Critique, I believe, is most powerful when it leaves open the possibility that we might be remade in the process of engaging another's worldview. This requires that we occasionally turn the critical gaze upon ourselves to leave open the possibility that we may be remade through an encounter with the other. So I want to conclude that the two autographic that I've chosen tries to showcase that we cannot have a binary thinking, we cannot have a binary division that this is I and this is we, or this is them, or this is you. Here we see that there are instances and places where the enemy and the other reaches a place of equality and respectful positions, political position, I would say. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Tonmoy?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Samreen Fatima. That was a wonderful paper. I'll go with the papers one by one. I would just like to comment a few facts which I found in each one's papers. I think all of them were really brilliant. Tonmoy, do we have time for that?
Yes, yes, Dee. We can continue. This is the last session of the day.
Yeah, and I was wondering if people were asking for feedbacks. Now, how do the feedbacks work?
So I will send them to the registered mail ID.
Okay. The first paper presenter, Mrs. Richa Chilana, she was speaking about the Wales and the Parda system with regard to the Parsi community and how this the division between veiled women and the concept and idea of the single monolithic identity of women inside the Parda. That was quite interesting because you see the Parsi community had been insular from many of the aspects, even during the colonial times. The kind of onslaught of colonial wrath that was let down on other communities like the Hindus and the Muslims. The Parsis were well out of it, but even then, how this kind of identity with regard to women, women as faceless, nameless, and passive entities, how that was downplayed totally in the texts that she intended to present. Parveen Mistri's novels, which were memoirs, are worth looking at. I think that's an interesting point that she makes. And she talks about the Mardana and the Zanana and the period custom and all those things that had crept into society as a superstition. So it was overall a good paper, Richa. The next paper presenter, Miss Jane Mary Joseph. I wish you could have shown us a few, paintings of Black Death, because you were speaking specifically about paintings. And when we talk about paintings, Black Death especially, which goes back in time, you see, the classical period, rather the medieval period, you see how the representationality and how it actually happened with the people. That is where I think there's a slight gap which that has to be bridged. But otherwise, I think you needed to go more slow with reading out your paper. But otherwise, this was an area which is hardly ever, we come across. When we come across classical paintings of the of the Byzantium times, we come across paintings by Rembrandt or Velasquez. Am I audible, by the by?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Come to classical paintings, wish to share the screen, because that's how we come across to see the delicate intricacies that may have hinted at the particular
Yes,
society working with. So I think that's your paper.
Thank you.
The next paper, Mr. Bormon, I think this is an area which is very, very interesting in the context of Bengal, at least, and in other states, I don't know. In Bengali, there has been a lot of written literature, and there is a poem called Ranar. And of course, I know that these foot well runners or male runners, they played a vital role and they were mythologized. They were, there was this element of storytelling. They built in personal relationships, and how you have, just tried to sync back and forth with the British rule as to how the Indian postal services, the Indian railways, and linking up them, the socio-cultural and the socio-historic times. That is interesting, but I think it could have been more literary. Otherwise, it was very insightful. Nevertheless, it was very insightful, and because we run short of time in these webinars, I wouldn't blame any of you. In fact, all the papers were beautiful. But when we write them and when we present them as papers in their own right, when we present them as papers in their own right, then what happens is the writing part and the speaking part is hardly, that there is always this difference. Okay. The next paper presenter was, I guess, Mrs. Neha Tiwari. She had talked about Satyajit Ray's Aguntuk. Now, the only thing I wish to say about her paper is Satyajit Ray has to be seen from the aspect of not only as a storyteller, but also as a director, because he was an unconventional director who, at that point of time when people were not very well conversant in the 70s with the existential directors across the globe, he drew the techniques and he drew the kind of, the storytelling techniques and the photographic techniques from those directors and from the, people who were actually working with cinema. And even in those black and white movies, the interplay of the intersectionality of music with tone of the voice and the quick flipping over of pictures and the sudden darkness and the sudden light, that has to be, I think, a bit studied. And when we talk about Satyajit Ray, we are opening up an entire discourse about cinema and film. And I think, separating Aguntuk from other, you could have drawn in more references, I mean, and, could have analyzed, and that would have been still a brilliant paper. And then the last paper presenter, Samreen Fatima. Yes, your paper was good. You had tried to talk about identity, but you see, when you're talking about the self, the other, and the other self, you see how these interchange. Sometimes these terms do interchange, and you have to talk about, you see, how these terms, they kind of marginally express themselves. And othering, now in post-colonial studies, do we always have this other, but we also have something like multiple identities. I wish you could have talked about that. And when we have something like multiple identities, we do away with the other, because how many others would there be in a multiple identity? And then we also need to think that in the context of, you've talked about anime and autographics, which is very much in nowadays, and people are working on this, and it's a very happening topic. And what is a literary element of this? I was just thinking, it made me think that what is the literary element of these autographics? Somewhere we have to make a line, we have to draw a line between when we actually talk about autographics and when we actually come to written literature, because this is a place where it merges. And when you were talking about Judith Butler, and when we're talking about identity, and when we are talking about identity politics, it has to be, identity, like, identity is figured, it is transfigured, it is remade with certain gross boundaries. And we cannot do away with the concept of boundaries. And I think you didn't mention that, because you see, identity can be transnational identity, it can be one's transcultural identity, it can be the element of, many other identities come in. It can be an imaginative identity, it can be a made-up identity. So anime, especially autographics, they kind of include all these areas. I think if you want to publish this paper, then you would certainly have to look into these areas. Thank you, all the paper presenters. And would we look at the feedback questions, or do we do away with as a session today? I would ask the organizer. Yes, Tanmoy, please enlighten us. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I think if anybody of them have anything to say, I mean, to respond to any of the thing that you have said, otherwise we will end with a vote of thanks.
Okay. I would like to thank on behalf of the all participants to Chairperson Ma'am, because very patiently she heard everyone and she has given her tips on how to improvise it. And that's something, usually these days, maybe due to lack of time or something, it never happens. But she has taken a note of every minute details and she has given. So it's worth that she was around and we have participated. And of course, when we will write a complete paper, we will keep all those things which we have so that we can send the improvised paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Neha Tiwari, for that, Thanksgiving. I would, in fact, would have talked on more, but for paucity of time with each paper. And is there anybody in specific who wants to ask a few questions to the paper presenters? Do we have time for that?
Yeah, we do have time for that if anybody wants to ask anything.
Very many questions, maybe 4 or 3 to 4 questions, maybe.
Okay, ma'am, I think Dr. Rosni is here. She wants to present her paper, so we can go ahead with this, I think.
We can accommodate her because I knew she was waiting.
Yeah. Sure. So, Dr. Rosni, if you were here, you can start.
Yes, I'm here. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible and visible both.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm apologize from my side for the glitch, and thanks for accommodating me. Before I begin my paper, I extend my appreciation to the organizers for organizing such a massive conference, and and I understand the difficulties for organizing such a massive conference. And thanks to the chair, especially for accommodating me. I straight away begin my paper. My paper is titled Decolonizing Technology and Post-Colonial Predicaments. So I'll read out the paper so as to stick within the time. Advancement in science and technology in India has been promulgated by various models of engagement with it. While the ideologies that harbor these models are rarely debated, its testing ground is usually the success and failure of various governmental programs. Since it was during the colonial period that the modern notion of science and technology made its way into India under the guise of civilizing mission, there were fervent sentiments against it on the side of nationalist movement. It was amid such hue and cry that Indian philosophical outlook regarding the nature of scientific and technological advancement took shape. Both Gandhi and Nehru viewed technology or development through machines as corruptive by nature. Hence, for them, the future of India lied in its villages or in rural town than in the cities. When the trajectory of technological development of India became a matter of debate in post-independent India, Nehru is perceived to have deviated from the Swadeshi path towards embracing technological imports. However, Nehru often swayed between these two alternatives, which eventually led to him adopting a stance that maintains a distance between citizens and machines. Capital-intensive technologies were kept away from these schemes which focused on small-scale technologies. This ambivalence towards big technologies continued with the subsequent governmental programs even post-Nehruvian era, which eventually molded into a view called appropriate technology. The idea of appropriate technology was essentialistic in a way that it undermined the capacity of developing countries or the third world, assuming that the third world cannot be the buyers of or consumers on par with the wealthy nations. Hence, this model prescribed economically viable technologies for the third world, for the developing countries, which eventually came to be understood as sustainable development. This idea of sustainability more or less prevails even today. And as you might have heard of this text, Schumacher's "Small is Beautiful," which became the canonical text in this respect. In broader terms, the antithetical attitude towards technology harbored by Swadeshi movement is hinged upon a diffusionist model, which upholds the view that modern machines have had their birth in the modern West. From where they are disseminated throughout the non-Western world. The idea behind the diffusionist model of technology is hinged upon an idea of innovation and dispersal. I would quote from David Arnold's work. This view of diffusionist model imagines that, I quote, all the creative processes associated with technology are presumed to lie in the hands, to lie in and with the West. Essential stages of design and development occur in the West. That is, where the capital, technical expertise, and the skilled labor resources are located. This leaves the rest of the world apparently sidelined and passive, existing simply as compliant market, or as Partha Chatterjee puts it, as the perpetual consumers of someone else's modernity, unquote. An alternative model is one that articulates an alternative model to this diffusionist model is one that articulates the dynamics of adaptation and use of technologies within a given domain. By documenting the everyday experience of small-scale machines such as sewing machines, bicycles, typewriters, and rice mills, as opposed to big technologies which required big capital investment, as was the case in railroads, irrigation projects, electrification schemes, etc. The question remains whether this model dismantles the other and replaces it, or whether it is just a subset of the diffusionist model. If we call this the other alternative model as an embedded one, this model views the diffusionist model as an antiquated view, which takes technology as an autonomous field of human endeavor. Looking favorably, of course, this alternative model looks favorably upon non-Western societies who appropriate modern technologies manufactured in the West, and it principally looks at the adaptation, compromise, and assimilation through which non-Western societies use technologies to acquire new meanings and usages. The question is, does this alternative model partake in the Swadeshi model? I would argue that this alternative model partakes in the Swadeshi model, which makes it to be the case that in effect, there is no alternative to Swadeshi model for technological thinking in India. In other words, what is the fundamental tenet of the Swadeshi model of technology? As is very well documented, Gandhi took a vehemently antagonistic stance towards modern machines. Among its alternative visionaries, one counts Malaviya as someone who held an alternative version of Swadeshi, which tried to weld it with modern aspirations towards technology. However, in the realm of vision concerning technology, his ideas clashed with the predominant version of Swadeshi movement, who advocated boycott of foreign goods, especially the British ones. Malaviya could not foresee technological development in India unless India is willing to import foreign machines and technical expertise. Malaviya's ideological rift with Swadeshi and his alternative developmental vision earned him a place in the Indian Industrial Commission, which was set up in 1916, which heralded a new era in the modernization of India. Firm believer of Hindu Renaissance, Malaviya mobilized financial resources for his revival project with effective fundraising, linking business entrepreneurship and industrialization with his project. In this regard, Gandhi's and Nehru's views diverged from the views of Malaviya, mainly on the question of modernization than on the question of Hindu Renaissance. Malaviya believed Hindu Renaissance to have a tempering effect on the wicked ambitions spawned by industrialization. It is the developmental model of technology which Malaviya subscribed to that clashed with the Swadeshi model. There were, of course, aberrant voices even during the colonial period, such as that of Vishweshwaraya's voice, whose views regarding advancement of technology through modernization was not leveraged upon a supplementary ideal of faith or spirituality, as we see in the case of Malavia. In post-independent India, we see more of similar voices unhinged from this supposedly spiritual ideal, advancing their technocratic visions with the aid of rallied political support. Technological advancement in India operates in contemporary India in a provisional manner, so to speak, unhinged from any long-term political visions. Nonetheless, as and when the state of government intervenes into its operations, it gets appropriated nonetheless under the guise of Swadeshi, if not by a stronger version of Swadeshi, then by a watered down version of Swadeshi. On the one hand, the question is whether the pro-people mode of provisional manner of functioning, as we see in the newly emerging digital technologies, or as in the case of Nandan Nilegani's entrepreneurship model of digitizing governmental welfare schemes and linking it with biometric identification system, etc., whether it can be regarded as moving in the direction of decolonization of technology or not is a question, in the sense of digitalization as an empowerment of the masses. The fact that it gets appropriated easily by the government as and when it is so desired shows that it is directionless in a sense, or it is a rather naive, naturalized view of technology. The advent of digital technologies, personal computing, etc., and their presence in everyday lives with the turn of the millennium has certainly made huge impact with respect to how we use technology as a network of multiplicities. We learn to recognize multiple forms of existences of semi-quasi objects or beings as possibilities, which in turn granted us hope with its own share of anxieties. Given this background, I would like to rephrase the post-colonial question concerning technologies with respect to the Indian situation. Should we understand the relics of Swadeshi model present in our articulations of technological thinking in itself as a sign of the ghostly presence of our colonized mind, which we have not yet been able to cast away? If it is so, how should we regard our post-colonial condition to be particularly insightful in showing us the way forward for the project of decolonizing technology? I would gesture towards proliferating the armory of Swadeshi, the idea of Swadeshi, by uncovering multiple versions of it that prevail amidst us. For grounding this exercise, bearing in mind the post-colonial insights regarding perils of Swadeshi as such, and thus engendering debates to an alternative. And in this respect, it is very pertinent to bear in mind those voices who were dismissive of Swadeshi at the point when this idea of Swadeshi in itself came into being, as was the case of Ambedkar's. So I conclude here, and I look forward if there are any comments on this. And thanks again for accommodating my paper in this session.
Yes, are there any comments? Can you hear me?
Yeah, ma'am, you are audible.
Yes, are there any comments from the spectators?
Let me check. I think there is no as such questions, as I can see in the chat box. So if you want to comment something on the paper, then we can end up this session. Yeah.
I think, Dr. Roshni, you've talked about colonialization of technology itself, and that is true because when we think of the West versus the East, it is always that the technology has been infiltrated from there and we are just the passive receivers, but that is not always the case. It is a give and take process, and we cannot, play down before this. Yes, of course, it is the colonization of technology so far as keeping in view the fact that we are a third world country, but that doesn't necessarily mean, and that doesn't always necessitate that we don't contribute to technology as such. And you've moved back and forth to show how various political leaders before independence and after independence, they have looked and they have, contributed in their own way to the perception of technology more than technology itself. So that perception of technology is something which can be dangerous so far as the mindset of the people are concerned. And even today, how do we perceive technology? What vibrations do we emit so far as our own technological progress is concerned? And how are we behaving in this pandemic? Well, that could have been extended. Thank you, Dr. Roshni. And is there any pool of questions or 2 to 3 questions from the people who are wanting to ask the paper presenters? I think this would not be towards me, but to the paper presenters. If there are any, we can take 2 more questions. Yes, are there any questions?
I think there is no such question as of now. I have also put if anyone wants to ask, but I can't see anything right now. Yeah, in that case, I think we can end the session here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Tonmoy, who has been a very good friend and a brother-like figure. Thank you, the organizers, for offering me the opportunity to chair this session, and thank you for the beautiful paper presentations. I thank all of you all.
Yeah, and also on the behalf of the organizers, I want to thank you, ma'am, for joining with us and also chairing this session. You rightly sum up the whole session in a very significant way. That's actually helped us to get all the ideas in a collective sense. And also, I want to thank all the 6 presenters, including Dr. Rosni, for bringing up diverse topic into this Zoom room. This has been a very engaging one. And also sorry on the part of the internet glitches and the other thing because of not having Rosni's presentation before. So we are happy to incorporate you in this session. So yeah, with that note, I think thank you everyone. Stay safe and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so who are present here, just an announcement. So from tomorrow 10, we have, 10:30, we have several other sessions. People from India and foreign, several academicians will join with us. So stay tuned for tomorrow. Tomorrow is the last day of this international conference. So I hope many of the familiar faces who are here will also join. So with that note, thank you. Have a good night from now also in advance. Yeah, thank you so much for joining with us.